The story of how an adolescent consort emerged from anonymity to become the sole female sovereign in China's history is a compelling one. Her ascent was not a product of fortune or a strategic marital alliance. Instead, she demonstrated a mastery of lethal court politics that would dwarf the skills of contemporary statesmen, methodically removing her adversaries and maneuvering three separate emperors to seize the ultimate authority. This exploration of ancient China will uncover the transformation of a powerless attendant into the nation's most formidable leader, a change achieved through sharp intellect, relentless ambition, and impeccable timing. Her incredible narrative unfolds over decades, marked by palace conspiracies, familial betrayals, and political assassinations that would redefine an entire dynasty. This account will guide you through her astonishing rise to supremacy. By the conclusion of this series, you will grasp precisely how she accomplished what seemed unattainable. To fully comprehend Wu Zetian's ascent, one must first understand the era into which she was born. It was the year 624 CE, during the nascent Tang dynasty, a period when China was enjoying a golden era of affluence and cultural flourishing. The Tang capital, Chang'an, stood as the most populous city on the planet, home to more than 1 million residents from a multitude of cultures and kingdoms. Traders journeyed along the Silk Road, importing rare commodities from distant lands like Persia and Rome. Buddhist monasteries coexisted with Taoist shrines and Confucian academies, while art, poetry, and scholarship thrived under imperial sponsorship. However, this gleaming exterior masked a society founded on strict social structures and absolute patriarchal control. The Confucian social framework positioned the emperor at the apex, succeeded by government officials, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Women were positioned entirely outside this formal structure, their identities based only on their connections to men as daughters, wives, or mothers. The greatest achievement for a woman was to produce sons who could bring distinction to their family name. The very idea of female ambition was not merely frowned upon, it was considered utterly beyond conception. Wu Zetian was brought into this world as Wu Zhao, the offspring of Wu Shiyu, a prosperous timber magnate who had backed the Tang dynasty's consolidation of power. Her family's origins were atypical for someone destined for the imperial court. The majority of consorts hailed from long-standing aristocratic lines with deep-rooted court affiliations. The Wu clan, though wealthy, were essentially considered new money, viewed with disdain by the established nobility who could trace their ancestry back for centuries. Wu Ziyue had 3 wives, a common practice for affluent men of that time. Wu Jiao's mother, Lady Yang, was his second wife, a circumstance that put Wu Jiao in a vulnerable spot within the family's internal order. Though legitimate, she was not the principal heir. Her older half-brothers from her father's first marriage were set to inherit the family enterprises and estates. This formative experience of vying for recognition and resources within a complicated household would serve as crucial preparation for the even more perilous environment of imperial politics she would later enter. From a young age, Wu Jiao showed a level of intelligence and resolve that distinguished her from her peers. While most girls from affluent backgrounds were taught only domestic arts such as embroidery, music, and home economics, Wu Jiao somehow received a far more extensive education. Historical accounts indicate that her father, possibly seeing her extraordinary talents, permitted her to study with her brothers. She mastered reading and writing classical Chinese, delved into history and philosophy, and was even instructed in mathematics and elementary military tactics. This education was revolutionary for a young woman of her era. The vast majority of women, including those of aristocratic birth, were practically illiterate. The ability to read and write was viewed as a masculine pursuit, one that might render a woman overly independent and thus unsuitable for marriage. Yet Wu Zetian absorbed information voraciously, acquiring not just literacy, but a genuine intellectual sophistication that would later empower her to hold debates with court scholars and author her own imperial edicts. Her physical appearance was also said to be remarkable, though descriptions from that period must be viewed through the lens of later political propaganda. Contemporary accounts portray her as extraordinarily beautiful, with flawless skin, refined features, and a commanding presence that made her stand out in any crowd. More critically, she possessed what Chinese historians referred to as dragon phoenix charisma, an almost mystical ability to command attention and inspire both loyalty and fear in those around her. Wu Zhao's childhood came to an abrupt end in 636 with the unexpected death of her father. She was merely 12 years old, and his passing dramatically altered her family's circumstances. Under Chinese inheritance laws, the family business and properties transferred to Wu Shiyu's eldest son from his first marriage. Wu Zhao, her mother, and her younger siblings found themselves reliant on the generosity of their half-brothers, who showed little desire to support them generously. This experience of sudden helplessness and financial instability would profoundly shape Wu Zhao's worldview. She learned firsthand how rapidly fortune could shift and how vulnerable women were in a system that offered them no independent legal or economic rights. Rather than accepting her diminished circumstances, she began to plan her escape from a life of genteel poverty and dependency. Her opportunity came in 638 when Emperor Taizong issued a summons for beautiful young women to join his imperial harem. This was a standard practice in Chinese courts, where the emperor maintained hundreds of concubines organized in elaborate hierarchies. For most families, having a daughter selected as an imperial concubine was seen as a great honor that could elevate their entire family status. For Wu Zhao, it represented something far more valuable, a chance to escape the limitations of her birth and enter the center of political power. At 14 years old, Wu Zhao was chosen from thousands of candidates to become a fifth-rank concubine, given the title Kai Ren, which meant talented person. This was not a particularly high rank in the complex hierarchy of imperial women, but it was enough to get her inside the Forbidden City and into proximity with the most powerful man in China. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, a complex ecosystem of competition, alliances, and intrigue that made the external political world look simple by comparison. Hundreds of women lived in luxurious apartments, attended by armies of servants, but most would never even meet the emperor, let alone bear his children or influence his decisions. The vast majority would live out their lives in gilded captivity, forgotten and irrelevant. Emperor Taizong, born Li Shimin, was one of the most distinguished rulers in Chinese history. He had assisted his father in founding the Tang dynasty and had personally commanded military campaigns that expanded Chinese territory to its greatest extent. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely dedicated to effective governance. However, he was also a middle-aged man with numerous wives and concubines, unlikely to give much notice to one teenage girl among so many. Wu Zhao grasped this challenge from the moment she arrived at the palace. Unlike other consorts who depended solely on their looks or tried to capture the emperor's attention with traditional feminine accomplishments, she adopted a completely different strategy. She made herself indispensable. Leveraging her unique education, Wu Zhao started offering to assist with administrative duties that other concubines deemed beneath them. She could read and write more proficiently than many court officials and possessed an intuitive grasp of bureaucratic procedures. When the emperor required documents to be transcribed or letters to be translated, Wu Zhao would step forward. When he desired someone to read historical texts to him, she was ready with perfect enunciation and insightful analysis. More importantly, she began to study the emperor himself with the focus of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. She learned his tastes, his tempers, his political anxieties, and his private insecurities. While other concubines attempted to amuse him, Wu Zhao became essential by serving as his intellectual partner and trusted confidant. This approach demanded immense patience and self-discipline. Wu Zhao spent months, which turned into years, gradually cultivating her connection with the emperor, while meticulously observing the intricate web of palace politics surrounding her. She identified the principal figures, understood the factional divides among court officials, and started to build her own network of allies among servants, eunuchs, and minor officials who had access to crucial information. The imperial court was fragmented into numerous rival factions based on provincial origins, philosophical disagreements, and individual allegiances. The most influential faction was comprised of the founding families who had aided in establishing the Tang dynasty and felt they had a right to perpetual influence. These aristocratic clans looked down upon newcomers like Wu Zhao and actively sought to restrict the emperor's ability to promote individuals from outside their ranks. Wu Zhao swiftly recognized that her merchant family background, once a perceived liability, was now an asset in this setting. She had no pre-existing factional ties, allowing her to move between different groups without being immediately labeled an adversary. She also possessed a knowledge of commerce and finance that the aristocratic officials, who saw trade as beneath them, lacked. As time passed, Wu Zhao's sway with Emperor Taizong steadily increased. She progressed from transcribing documents to drafting them, from reading historical works to debating their political significance, and from observing court discussions to contributing her own perspectives. The emperor, who had initially viewed her as just another attractive consort, started to acknowledge her extraordinary intellect and depend on her judgment. However, Wu Zhao's aspirations reached far beyond simply being the emperor's preferred concubine. She knew that her position, though privileged, was inherently unstable. Imperial favor could vanish in an instant, and consorts who lost their standing often ended up exiled to remote monasteries or worse. She understood the need to construct a more durable base of power, which involved extending her influence beyond her personal bond with the emperor. She started to foster relationships with the emperor's children, especially his heir apparent, Prince Li Qingcheng. This was a perilous endeavor, as court rules strictly forbade contact between concubines and imperial princes. Yet Wu Zhao skillfully framed her interactions as educational and administrative, not personal. She offered to assist with the prince's official letters, shared insights on court dynamics, and progressively made herself valuable to the future emperor as well as the current one. Regrettably, Wu Zhao's careful nurturing of Prince Li Qingcheng would turn out to be a strategic error that almost destroyed her political career before it had a chance to flourish. The prince, despite being the designated successor, was battling personal issues that rendered him increasingly erratic and undependable as a political associate. Li Qingcheng had been raised under immense pressure as the crown prince of the world's mightiest empire. Every detail of his existence was closely monitored by court officials. His education was strictly overseen by Confucian mentors, and the weight of his future imperial duties rested heavily on his young shoulders. Instead of embracing these expectations, the prince began to rebel in progressively reckless ways. He became infatuated with Turkic culture, adopting their dress, customs, and even their military methods. This was viewed as highly unbecoming for a future Chinese sovereign, particularly as the Tang dynasty was engaged in conflicts with Turkic tribes on its northern border. Even more alarmingly, Li Changcheng started associating with unsavory individuals and partaking in activities that court observers deemed beneath imperial dignity. Wu Jiao observed these events with mounting anxiety. Her political acumen told her that the prince's volatile behavior was leaving him exposed to his court enemies and consequently making her vulnerable as well. She had dedicated considerable time and effort to forging a relationship with him, but that investment was now turning into a liability. The crisis reached its peak in 643 when Prince Li Chengchen was implicated in a plot to assassinate his father and seize the throne prematurely. The scheme was uncovered before it could be carried out, but the mere fact that the crown prince had been involved in such a conspiracy sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Emperor Taizong was heartbroken by his son's betrayal and launched an immediate investigation into everyone associated with the prince. Wu Jiao found herself in an extremely precarious situation. Her links to Li Chengchen were well known, and many court officials saw her as a potential accomplice who might have incited the prince's rebellious actions. The subsequent investigation was thorough and merciless, with dozens of individuals being interrogated, tortured, and executed for their supposed roles in the plot. However, Wu Jiao's years of careful observation and relationship building yielded unexpected benefits. She had fostered connections with officials from various factions, and several of them vouched for her during the inquiry. More importantly, her genuine value to the emperor as an administrative aide and intellectual companion had built a reserve of goodwill that shielded her from the most severe accusations. Emperor Taizong eventually decided that Wu Jiao had been naive rather than malicious in her dealings with the disgraced prince. She had been manipulated by Li Chengchen, not the other way around, making her a victim of his schemes rather than a co-conspirator in his rebellion. This conclusion allowed the emperor to continue his relationship with Wu Jiao while emotionally distancing himself from his son's betrayal. The prince's conspiracy crisis imparted several vital lessons about palace politics to Wu Jiao, which would inform her future actions. First, she learned that supporting the wrong individual, even for logical reasons, could have disastrous consequences. Political strategies that appeared sound could be undone overnight by unforeseen events or character defects. Second, she realized the immense importance of cultivating relationships across different factions. Her survival had hinged not on the allegiance of a single group, but on having allies in various camps who could attest to her character and utility. Most critically, Wu Jiao understood that her long-term safety depended not on aligning with any one person, regardless of their power, but on making herself intrinsically valuable to the imperial system itself. She needed to become so useful, knowledgeable, and well-connected that dismissing her would be more detrimental than retaining her. With Prince Lingchengqian disgraced and eventually sent into exile, Emperor Taizong named his ninth son, Lingxi, as the new crown prince. Lingxi was the antithesis of his predecessor, diligent, respectful of tradition, and genuinely dedicated to preparing for his imperial duties. However, he was also young, inexperienced, and somewhat daunted by the immense expectations now placed upon him. Wu Jiao saw an opportunity in the new crown prince's circumstances. In contrast to her relationship with Lingchengqian, which was built on personal charm and administrative help, her strategy with Lingxi would be more calculated and deliberate. She would present herself not as a friend or companion, but as a vital asset for his future reign as emperor. She started by analyzing Li Qi's personality, interests, and vulnerabilities with the same systematic approach she had used with his father. The young prince was bright, but lacked self-assurance in his own decisions. He was well versed in classical literature, but had little first-hand experience with the practicalities of governing a vast empire. Crucially, he was encircled by advisors who were either too sycophantic to offer candid advice or too preoccupied with their own ambitions to prioritize his needs. Wu Jiao gradually integrated herself into this advisory circle, not to replace existing counselors, but as a unique resource offering perspectives that were otherwise unavailable. She provided insights into court gossip and factional dynamics that the prince's official mentors, constrained by protocol, could not discuss. She delivered frank evaluations of policy proposals that his fawning attendants would never dare to question. More discreetly, she started to frame herself as Li Qi's connection to the outside world, beyond the sheltered palace environment. As the daughter of a former merchant who had known hardship, she could articulate the real-world effects of imperial policies in a way that aristocratic advisors, cushioned by generations of privilege, simply could not. This strategy demanded that Wu Jiao navigate an extremely delicate path. She had to be valuable enough to the crown prince to earn his protection and support, but not so deeply involved in his affairs as to be accused of manipulating him for personal gain. She needed to project loyalty and wisdom while maintaining a facade of appropriate modesty and respect. This balancing act grew even more complicated as Emperor Taizong's health started to fail in the late 640s. The emperor, now in his 50s and worn out by decades of warfare and administrative duties, was showing signs of aging and illness, which made the issue of imperial succession increasingly pressing. Court officials began maneuvering for position in anticipation of the new reign, and the contest for influence over the future emperor grew fierce. Wu Zhao found herself caught between two distinct centers of power: the current imperial court around Emperor Taizong, where she had painstakingly built her standing, and the nascent court of Crown Prince Li Ji, where she was striving to forge new alliances and influence. Juggling both relationships at once called for exceptional diplomatic tact and political acumen. She had to remain useful to the reigning emperor while simultaneously establishing her credibility with his heir, all without giving any impression of disloyalty or opportunism that could ruin her standing with either. This task was made more difficult by the fact that the father and son, despite their mutual respect, had different personalities, priorities, and approaches to governance that occasionally led to friction. Emperor Taizong was a warrior scholar who had personally led armies and conquered new lands. He valued decisive action, personal bravery, and strong leadership. His governance was hands-on and pragmatic, informed by his experience as a military leader accustomed to making swift decisions with limited information. Crown Prince Li Ji, in contrast, was more reflective and cautious. He preferred to analyze issues thoroughly before taking action, to seek advice from multiple counselors before making a choice, and to weigh the long-term consequences of policies over immediate gains. His style of rule was more collaborative and systematic than his father's, but also potentially more hesitant and indecisive. Wu Jiao tailored her interactions to suit each man's character and preferences. With Emperor Taizong, she highlighted practical solutions and immediate advantages. She delivered information succinctly, gave clear recommendations, and showed how her ideas aligned with his established goals and policies. Her communications with him were direct, self-assured, and results-oriented. With Crown Prince Li Ji, she employed a more subtle approach. She offered various viewpoints on complex matters, acknowledged potential difficulties and uncertainties, and stressed the need for consensus among different factions before enacting significant changes. Her dealings with him were more deferential and cooperative, positioning her as a resource to aid his decision-making rather than an advocate for particular outcomes. This dual strategy proved highly effective for several years, enabling Wu Zetian to solidify her position with both the current and future emperors, while steering clear of the factional strife that brought down many other court figures during periods of succession. However, it also created new vulnerabilities that would soon put her political prowess to the ultimate test. As Emperor Taizong's health continued to worsen, rumors began to spread about an inappropriate relationship between Wu Jiao and Crown Prince Li Ji. These rumors were likely unavoidable, given the extensive time they spent together and the clear intelligence and ambition Wu Jiao displayed. In a court culture that primarily saw women as objects of desire rather than political players, any significant interaction between an attractive concubine and a young prince was bound to be viewed through a romanticized lens. The gossip was especially dangerous because it breached fundamental protocols surrounding imperial succession. Concubines were considered the property of the emperor and were expected to be loyal only to him. Any hint that a concubine was forming ties with potential heirs could be seen as treason, adultery, or both. Even if their relationship was purely political and administrative, the mere appearance of impropriety could be ruinous for everyone involved. Wu Jiao realized her carefully built position was becoming precarious. She could not continue to build influence with Li Ji without facing accusations that could lead to her execution. Yet she could not abandon her investment in the future emperor without giving up the security and power she had worked so diligently to obtain. The solution she conceived was characteristically audacious and bold. Instead of trying to conceal or downplay her relationship with the crown prince, Wu Jiao decided to completely recontextualize it. She would turn what seemed to be a weakness into a strategic asset by fundamentally altering the terms of the conversation. In early 649, with Emperor Taizong on his deathbed, Wu Jiao made a choice that would change the trajectory of Chinese history. Rather than passively awaiting her fate, she decided to seize control of her destiny in a manner never before attempted by any woman in China's past. However, that extraordinary gamble and its even more remarkable results would have to wait for the emperor's passing and the start of a completely new chapter in Wu Zetian's unyielding quest for supreme power. The death of Emperor Taizong in 649 CE signaled the close of one era and the start of Wu Jiao's most perilous venture yet. According to long-standing Chinese custom, upon an emperor's death, his concubines had two possible destinies. They could be interred alive with their sovereign to attend to him in the next life, or they could have their heads shaved and live out their days as Buddhist nuns in secluded monasteries. Neither path offered any prospect of retaining political sway or personal autonomy. For the majority of concubines, this moment marked the unavoidable conclusion to whatever brief period of luxury and significance they had known. They would fade into oblivion, overlooked by history and inconsequential to the empire's future. Yet Wu Jiao had spent more than a decade preparing for this very eventuality and had no intention of submitting to either traditional outcome. The funeral rites for Emperor Taizong were a magnificent exhibition of imperial splendor that continued for months. His body was laid in state at the Grand Daming Palace as officials from all corners of the empire journeyed to Chang'an to offer their condolences. Buddhist monks recited prayers for his soul, Confucian scholars wrote intricate eulogies honoring his legacy, and Taoist priests conducted rituals to assure his tranquil passage to the afterlife. Wu Jiao took part in these rituals with impeccable decorum, showing the sorrow and loyalty expected of an imperial consort. She donned the white garments of mourning, shed tears at the designated times, and adhered to all the elaborate protocols that dictated conduct during the lengthy mourning period. To any outside observer, she looked like just another bereaved woman getting ready to accept her destiny as a forgotten artifact of a past reign. However, behind this veneer of conventional female deference, Wu Jiao was orchestrating the most daring political maneuver in Chinese history. In the turbulent weeks between the emperor's demise and his heir's official enthronement, she was covertly corresponding with Crown Prince Li Ji, who was preparing to become Emperor Gaozong. These communications were exceedingly risky, as any interaction between a deceased emperor's concubine and his successor could be construed as proof of an illicit affair that had started while Taizong was still alive. The exact content of these exchanges is lost to time, but their outcome was clear. Instead of letting Wu Jiao vanish into a monastery as custom required, the new emperor, Gaozong, stepped in to alter her fate. Wielding his new authority as ruler, he proclaimed that Wu Jiao's administrative talents and intellectual prowess were too precious to be lost to religious seclusion. He declared that she would be summoned back to the imperial court to serve in his administration. This decree sent shockwaves through the entire imperial establishment. No Chinese emperor had ever before brought his father's concubine back into active service. The move was not just unconventional, it was unimaginable. Court officials were appalled by what they perceived as a breach of the fundamental moral codes that guided imperial conduct. Buddhist clergy were outraged by the emperor's seeming indifference to proper religious customs. Even the general populace across the empire buzzed with talk about the young emperor's peculiar choice to surround himself with his father's former women. However, Emperor Gaozong was not acting on a whim or out of irrationality. He was a deliberate and methodical ruler who had observed Wu Zhao's abilities for years and recognized her potential worth to his government. Unlike his father, who was an experienced military leader and skilled politician upon taking the throne, Gaozong was a young man with limited hands-on governing experience. The Tang Empire in 649 was confronting numerous challenges that demanded swift action. Turkic tribes were conducting raids on the northern border, Korean kingdoms were challenging Chinese authority on the peninsula, and internal uprisings were erupting in several provinces. The imperial administration was controlled by powerful aristocratic clans with their own agendas, who were not necessarily devoted to the new emperor. To manage these intricate issues required advisors who were both skilled and entirely reliant on the emperor's favor for their status and safety. Wu Zhao met this description perfectly. Her intelligence and administrative prowess had been demonstrated over many years of service to Emperor Taizong. Her merchant family background meant she lacked an independent base of power that could challenge imperial authority. Most crucially, her controversial return to court made her completely dependent on Emperor Gaozong's safeguarding. She could not survive politically without his backing, which ensured her loyalty in a way that the elitants of traditional aristocratic advisors never could. The emperor's decision to recall Wu Jiao was thus both personally driven and politically astute. He was bringing back a woman he trusted and found intellectually engaging. At the same time, he was acquiring a uniquely valuable political asset who could assist him in navigating the perilous initial years of his reign. Wu Jiao came back to the imperial court in 650, not as a concubine, but as something entirely new in Chinese history. A female government official with tangible administrative duties and political sway. Her official title was unassuming, but her actual influence was far greater. She had direct access to the emperor, took part in policy debates, and steadily began to shape major decisions concerning both domestic affairs and foreign relations. Her first significant hurdle was to gain credibility with the existing court bureaucracy, the majority of whom saw her appointment as a hazardous precedent that defied traditional gender roles and governmental norms. These officials had dedicated their entire lives to ascending through established hierarchies based on civil service exams, family ties, and factional allegiances. The abrupt arrival of a woman with direct imperial access and apparent policy-making power challenged their very understanding of how government should function. Wu Zhao confronted this opposition with her typical intelligence and patience. Rather than attempting to directly challenge or bypass the established bureaucratic system, she discovered methods to operate within and around it. She initially concentrated on areas where her distinct background and abilities offered clear benefits that even dubious officials had to concede. Her upbringing as a merchant's daughter, for instance, provided her with knowledge of trade and economic matters that aristocratic officials did not possess. When discussions arose regarding tax collection, commercial laws, or public works, Wu Zhao could offer practical viewpoints grounded in real-world knowledge rather than just theoretical understanding. Her suggestions were frequently more effective than those from officials whose economic knowledge was derived solely from classical literature. She also utilized her years of observation and relationship building at the imperial court to become a vital source of information on the dynamics and personal conflicts among government officials. Emperor Gaozun, like any ruler, needed to comprehend the intricate web of alliances and rivalries within his administration to make sound personnel choices and thwart potential plots. Wu Zhao's exhaustive knowledge of court politics made her an indispensable intelligence asset. More discreetly, she started to position herself as a liaison between the emperor and various groups that traditional advisors struggled to understand or communicate with effectively. Her modest origins enabled her to speak with authority about the issues facing merchants, farmers, and artisans in a way aristocratic officials could not. Her gender granted her access to information about the imperial harem and the concerns of court women that was unavailable to male advisors. This multifaceted strategy steadily solidified Wu Zhao's role as an essential member of Emperor Gaozong's inner circle. Officials who had once opposed her appointment began to see her value and seek her backing for their own projects. Factional leaders who had treated her as an outsider started to view her as a potential ally whose influence with the emperor could serve their interests. However, Wu Zhao's expanding political power also brought new risks that she had to manage with great care. The more integral she became to the emperor's government, the more of a threat she seemed to established power centers that had reasons to curtail her authority. The most severe opposition originated from the Empress and the imperial in-laws, who had anticipated controlling the new reign. Empress Wang had wed Li Ji several years before he ascended the throne, and she reasonably expected that becoming emperor would grant her a position of considerable influence at court. As the ruler's official spouse, she was supposed to be the most prominent woman in the empire, with authority over the imperial household and informal sway over policies related to women and family affairs. Instead, Empress Wang found herself increasingly sidelined by Wu Zhao's growing influence with her husband. The emperor devoted more time consulting with Wu Zhao on state matters than he did discussing personal issues with his official wife. Court observers started to note that Wu Zhao's suggestions held more sway in imperial decisions than the empress's views. This situation was not merely a personal affront to Empress Wang, it was a political threat to her entire extended family. The Wang clan had invested heavily in her marriage to the future emperor, anticipating that her role as empress would grant them privileged access to government roles, profitable contracts, and policy influence. If Wu Zhao continued to amass power at the empress's expense, the Wang family's political investments would diminish and their adversaries would gain an advantage. Empress Wang's reaction to this predicament revealed both her shortcomings as a political strategist and the fundamental contrasts between her approach to power and Wu Zhao's methods. Instead of trying to outmatch Wu Zhao intellectually or administratively, the Empress concentrated on highlighting traditional gender roles and moral standards. She cast herself as the guardian of conventional values against Wu Zhao's perilous innovations. This tactic initially found some traction among conservative court officials who were already uneasy with Wu Zhao's unprecedented role in government. Empress Wang contended that permitting a former concubine to engage in policy debates breached fundamental tenets of imperial dignity and Confucian ethics. She implied that the emperor's dependence on Wu Zhao's counsel was improper and could potentially erode the moral underpinnings of imperial government. However, Empress Wang's strategy had a crucial flaw. It provided no viable substitute for Wu Zhao's contributions. The Empress could decry Wu Zhao's influence, but she could not replicate Wu Zhao's administrative expertise, political astuteness, or economic knowledge. Her arguments were founded on abstract ideals rather than tangible outcomes, which made them less persuasive to an emperor grappling with genuine governmental difficulties. Wu Zhao understood the danger Empress Wang posed, but she also knew that a direct confrontation would be counterproductive. Any open clash between the emperor's wife and his advisor would compel Emperor Gaozong to take a side, and established protocol heavily favored the empress in such conflicts. Wu Zhao required a more subtle tactic that would weaken her rival without sparking an overt crisis. Her solution was to make herself even more essential while concurrently highlighting the shortcomings of traditional methods of imperial administration. When policy discussions occurred, Wu Zhao consistently proposed more practical and effective solutions than other advisors, including indirect alternatives to suggestions from the empress's supporters. When administrative issues arose, she delivered quicker and more thorough solutions than the established bureaucratic system. More importantly, Wu Zhao began to document and promote her role in successful government projects. When her advice resulted in higher tax collections, she ensured the emperor was aware of her part in that success. When her insights helped settle diplomatic disputes or quell internal uprisings, she made sure her contributions were noted in official records and remembered by important officials. This methodical approach to building and showcasing her value created a strong case for maintaining and increasing her influence, one based on demonstrable achievements rather than theoretical ideals. Even officials who were philosophically against female involvement in government struggled to argue with Wu Zhao's record of successful policy contributions. The rivalry between Wu Zhao and Empress Wang escalated through the early 650s as both women strove to solidify their influence with the emperor and form supportive alliances among court officials. This competition was further complicated by the birth of children to both women, which introduced succession politics into the already intricate dynamics of imperial court rivalry. Empress Wang delivered a daughter in 651, a disappointment since male heirs were crucial for ensuring the dynasty's continuation. Wu Zhao, on the other hand, had given birth to a son in 652, and another in 653. These births significantly shifted the power balance between the two women. Wu Zhao's sons were potential heirs to the throne, whereas the empress's daughter was not. The existence of male heirs from Wu Zhao opened up new political possibilities that neither woman had previously envisioned. If anything were to happen to Emperor Gaozong, or if he chose to name one of Wu Zhao's sons as his successor, she could potentially become the mother of a future emperor. This possibility offered a route to enduring political security and influence that far surpassed her current position as an imperial advisor. However, the birth of these children also introduced new vulnerabilities and risks. The imperial court protocols for imperial succession were complex and politically charged, with established rules for determining which sons were considered legitimate heirs and which women were recognized as imperial mothers. Wu Zhao's unconventional status as a recalled concubine rather than an official wife complicated these matters and gave her adversaries new ammunition against her expanding influence. The situation grew even more complex in 654 when a tragedy struck the imperial family, forever altering the path of Wu Zhao's career and Chinese history itself. The precise details of the event are still debated by historians, but its effects were undeniable. Empress Wang's infant daughter passed away under mysterious circumstances, and Wu Zhao was accused of murdering the child to remove a potential competitor. The accusation was calamitous and potentially lethal. If Wu Zhao were found guilty of killing an imperial child, she would face immediate execution, along with all her relatives and allies. The charge was especially grave because it combined several of the most serious offenses in imperial China: treason against the royal family, a violation of fundamental moral principles protecting children, and a betrayal of trusted access to the imperial household. Yet the accusation also exposed the desperation of Wu Zhao's foes and their failure to challenge her influence through conventional political tactics. The timing and nature of the charges suggested they were driven more by factional rivalry than by any real proof of wrongdoing. This presented an opportunity for Wu Zhao to turn the crisis to her advantage, provided she could skillfully manage the political fallout. Her handling of the murder accusation would showcase both her political brilliance and her willingness to employ the most ruthless strategies necessary to protect and advance her standing. The tactics she used during this crisis would set a precedent for her behavior throughout her subsequent career as she ascended toward absolute power in the Chinese Empire. However, the specific methods Wu Zhao employed to survive and triumph over this potentially fatal challenge, and the long-term repercussions of her decisions for both her own future and the stability of the Tang dynasty, would prove to be even more extraordinary than anything she had accomplished thus far. The murder accusation against Wu Zhao was the most perilous moment of her political career, but it also exposed the fundamental weakness of her enemy's position. The allegations were founded more on court gossip and factional animosity than on concrete evidence, which provided Wu Zhao with an opening to maneuver if she could control the narrative and sway public opinion in her favor. Her initial move was characteristically bold and unforeseen. Instead of retreating into defensive denials or seeking protection through conventional channels, Wu Zhao opted to launch an offensive against her accusers. She began by methodically documenting the sequence of events surrounding the infant's death, collecting statements from servants, physicians, and other witnesses who were present in the imperial household during that time. This inquiry brought to light several inconvenient facts that weakened the murder theory. The child had been sick for several days before her death, exhibiting symptoms consistent with common childhood illnesses that claimed many imperial infants despite the best available medical care. Multiple physicians had examined the baby and administered treatments that were ultimately unsuccessful. Most importantly, Wu Zhao had been in the company of other court officials for most of the period when the supposed crime took place, making it nearly impossible for her to have administered poison or committed any other violent act. However, Wu Zhao knew that facts alone would not be enough to shield her from politically motivated charges. She needed to reframe the entire debate, moving it from questions of her personal guilt to broader issues concerning the stability and efficiency of the imperial government. Her survival hinged on appearing more valuable to the emperor and the empire than her adversaries. She achieved this shift by portraying the accusations as part of a larger plot by conservative factions to weaken Emperor Gaozong's authority and undo the administrative reforms that had made his government more effective. Wu Zhao contended that her enemies were exploiting the tragic death of an infant as a pretext to attack innovative governance methods that threatened their traditional privileges and power. This reframing was politically brilliant because it transformed Wu Zhao from a defendant in a criminal proceeding into a symbol of progressive government reform. Officials who supported modernizing the imperial bureaucracy found themselves defending Wu Zhao, not necessarily out of personal affinity, but because an attack on her was an attack on the broader reform agenda they supported. Conversely, officials who opposed her became associated with reactionary opposition to beneficial changes in government. Emperor Gaozong, who had invested considerable political capital in Wu Zhao's appointment and had personally benefited from her administrative work, immediately understood the implications. If Wu Zhao were removed from her position under these circumstances, it would indicate that traditional factions could override his decisions and initiatives by fabricating scandals. His authority as emperor would be permanently weakened if he allowed politically motivated accusations to dictate his administration. The emperor's reaction demonstrated both his political sophistication and his firm commitment to protecting Wu Zhao from her enemies. Rather than holding a private inquiry that could be swayed by factional interests, he announced that the accusations would be reviewed through formal legal processes, open to observation by court officials and foreign envoys. This level of transparency made it significantly harder for Wu Zhao's opponents to tamper with evidence or testimony. More importantly, Emperor Gaozong used the investigation as a chance to review and fortify Wu Zhao's official role within the government. He declared that, irrespective of the outcome of the criminal charges, Wu Zhao's administrative contributions were so valuable that her responsibilities would be expanded and formalized with new titles, making her status less susceptible to future political attacks. This declaration sent a clear signal to the court factions about the emperor's priorities. Officials wishing to remain in imperial favor would need to cooperate with Wu Zhao, not oppose her. Those who continued to resist her would find themselves increasingly marginalized from the centers of power and decision-making. The formal investigation into the murder allegations proceeded meticulously over several months, involving testimony from numerous witnesses and the examination of physical evidence by multiple experts. The process was designed to be thorough enough to satisfy doubters, while also showcasing the flimsiness of the case against Wu Zhao. Throughout this period, Wu Zhao continued to carry out her administrative duties with her usual competence and efficiency. She attended policy meetings, drafted official documents, and gave advice on diplomatic and military issues, as though the accusations were a mere temporary inconvenience. This conduct reinforced her image as a devoted public servant, whose main focus was effective governance, not personal survival. The investigation's final report, released in early 655, officially cleared Wu Zhao of any criminal involvement in the infant's death. The report determined that the child had died from natural causes, possibly exacerbated by the limited medical understanding of childhood diseases at the time. More significantly, the report rebuked the officials who had spread the murder allegations, stating they had acted irresponsibly and in a manner potentially damaging to imperial interests. However, Wu Zhao's exoneration came at a price that would influence her future political tactics. The months of controversy had exposed the deep-seated opposition to her influence among traditional court factions and the extreme measures her enemies were willing to take to remove her. She understood that surviving this single attack did not guarantee protection from future plots, and that her position would remain inherently vulnerable as long as she lacked a formal authority that could not be easily contested. Her solution to this dilemma would prove even more audacious than her previous political maneuvers. Instead of merely trying to reinforce her existing role as an imperial advisor, Wu Jiao began planning to fundamentally alter her status within the imperial hierarchy in a way that would make future attacks against her much more difficult and perilous for her enemies. The key to this transformation was her relationship with Emperor Gaozong and her increasing sway over imperial succession politics. Wu Jiao had already proven her worth as an administrator and policy advisor. However, these roles, no matter how significant, were still technically subordinate and could be eliminated if political winds shifted. She needed to attain a form of power that was more lasting and legally sanctioned. The strategy she formulated involved using her status as the mother of potential imperial heirs to demand formal recognition as an imperial wife rather than just a recalled concubine. This change in status would not only grant her greater legal safeguards and ceremonial power, but would also establish her sons as legitimate contenders for the imperial succession, giving her a long-term interest in the dynasty's future. However, achieving this transformation meant Wu Jiao had to challenge centuries of precedent and protocol that dictated imperial marriages and succession. No emperor in Chinese history had ever elevated his father's former concubine to the rank of empress, and the practical and symbolic ramifications of such an unprecedented move would face immense opposition from traditional court factions. Wu Jiao started preparing for this campaign by methodically garnering support from key groups whose backing would be crucial for her success. She fostered relationships with military commanders who appreciated her insights into strategic planning and resource management. She formed alliances with provincial governors who valued her understanding of local economic conditions and administrative issues. Most importantly, she reinforced her ties with younger court officials who were more receptive to innovative governance and less bound by traditional constraints on female political involvement. This coalition-building effort required Wu Jiao to prove her value to each group in ways they found persuasive and relevant to their own interests. Military officers needed to see that her influence resulted in better funding and strategic direction for their campaigns. Provincial administrators wanted evidence that her policy suggestions improved tax collection and local stability. Court officials needed assurance that supporting her would further their own careers and political goals. Wu Jiao provided these demonstrations through a series of successful policy initiatives that showcased her administrative abilities while creating political obligations among key constituencies. She established new systems for military logistics that enhanced the effectiveness of campaigns against Turkic and Korean forces. She introduced innovative methods for tax collection and agricultural development that boosted imperial income while lessening the load on local communities. She implemented new procedures for personnel evaluation and promotion that made government service more appealing to talented individuals from varied backgrounds. Each of these achievements served multiple functions in Wu Jiao's broader political strategy. They offered concrete proof of her value to the imperial administration, making it harder for opponents to claim her influence was merely personal rather than professional. They created networks of officials and military officers who had a direct interest in maintaining and expanding her authority. Most importantly, they demonstrated that Wu Jiao's approach to governance yielded better outcomes than traditional methods, giving Emperor Gaozong practical reasons to support her elevation beyond personal affection or loyalty. By late 655, Wu Jiao felt secure enough in her political standing to initiate the final stage of her campaign for formal recognition as Empress. This would necessitate a direct challenge to Empress Wang and the powerful family networks that backed the existing imperial marriage, making it the most perilous gamble of her career. Success would grant her unprecedented power and security, but failure would likely lead to exile or execution for herself and her children. The opening move in this campaign came from an unexpected source. revealing Wu Zhao's sophisticated grasp of imperial psychology and court politics. Instead of directly asking Emperor Gaozong to divorce his current wife, she began subtly questioning whether the existing imperial marriage was providing adequate support for the emperor's governing duties and personal well-being. Wu Zhao's approach was indirect but methodical. During policy discussions, she would occasionally remark on how much more effective the emperor could be if he had a partner who truly understood the intricacies of imperial administration. In private conversations, she would voice concern about the emperor's health and stress, suggesting he needed someone who could offer both intellectual companionship and emotional support during the challenging times of his reign. These conversations were meticulously planned to sow seeds of dissatisfaction with the emperor's current domestic situation, without overtly promoting her own interests. Wu Zhao wanted Emperor Gaozong to arrive at his own conclusion about the shortcomings of his marriage to Empress Wang, making any subsequent changes seem like his own initiative rather than her manipulation. The strategy functioned precisely as she had planned. Emperor Gaozong began to contrast his interactions with Wu Zhao, which were intellectually engaging and politically fruitful, with his relationship with Empress Wang, which was formal, ceremonial, and largely disconnected from his work as emperor. The difference became increasingly stark and frustrating for him, as he recognized how much more fulfillment and support he received from Wu Zhao than from his official wife. This growing dissatisfaction was fueled by Wu Zhao's continued displays of her administrative skill and political acumen. During the winter of 655, a series of crises put the imperial government's ability to respond effectively to unforeseen challenges to the test. Severe floods in several southern provinces disrupted agriculture and created displaced populations in need of emergency aid. Diplomatic friction with Korean kingdoms escalated into military clashes that demanded swift troop and supply deployments. Internal rebellions in the western regions threatened to spread if not quelled quickly and firmly. Wu Zhao's responses to these crises were quicker, more thorough, and more effective than those from traditional government bodies. Her recommendations for flood relief were based on a practical understanding of agricultural economics, not just theoretical knowledge. Her strategic evaluations of military situations showed a genuine grasp of logistics and supply chain management, rather than abstract principles of war. Her proposals for handling internal uprisings displayed a sophisticated analysis of regional politics and ethnic relations, not just conventional punishment methods. Emperor Gaozong could not fail to observe that Wu Zhao consistently offered better advice and more useful insights than his other advisors, including those considered experts in their fields. This comparison made him increasingly exasperated with the limitations of his current advisory system and more appreciative of Wu Zhao's unique contributions to effective governance. The contrast was especially pronounced when he compared Wu Zhao's capabilities to those of Empress Wang, who played no significant role in addressing any of the major challenges facing the empire. The Empress was expected to concentrate on ceremonial duties and household management, activities that appeared trivial compared to the life and death decisions of imperial administration. Emperor Gaozong started to wonder if his domestic situation was suitable for someone who required maximum support in ruling the world's largest and most complex empire. Wu Zhao carefully observed the emperor's shifting mindset and began to prepare for the crucial conversation that would decide her future. She knew she would have only one chance to propose her elevation to Empress, and that the timing, presentation, and reasoning for her request would be absolutely vital to its success. Everything she had accomplished over the past decade was a prelude to this single moment of ultimate risk and opportunity. The conversation finally occurred in early 656 during a private meeting where Wu Jiao and Emperor Gaozong were reviewing reports on the effectiveness of recent policy reforms. The discussion naturally shifted to broader questions of governmental efficiency and the emperor's need for comprehensive support in his duties. Wu Jiao started by acknowledging the immense responsibilities Emperor Gaozong shouldered as ruler of the Tang Empire, highlighting how much more complex imperial administration had become. She pointed out that past emperors could rely on simpler government structures, but contemporary issues demanded more sophisticated approaches. From this basis, she gradually steered the conversation toward whether the emperor's personal and domestic life adequately supported his professional duties. Wu Jiao suggested that effective imperial rule required not just skilled advisors, but also intimate partners who could offer intellectual partnership, emotional support, and practical help with the constant stream of decisions. The unspoken critique of Empress Wang was subtle yet clear. Wu Jiao was implying that the emperor needed a wife who could be a true partner in governance, someone who understood administrative complexities and could contribute to policy discussions. The current empress, regardless of her personal qualities, simply lacked the necessary skills and experience for such a role. Emperor Gaozong's reaction showed that Wu Jiao's months of careful groundwork had paid off. He confessed that he had been having similar thoughts, realizing his governmental duties were not well supported by his current domestic situation. He admitted that his most productive conversations about state affairs were with Wu Jiao, not his official wife, and this state of affairs seemed both personally unfulfilling and professionally inefficient. More significantly, Emperor Gaozong began to consider the practical and political consequences of altering his marital status to better align his personal relationships with his governing needs. He asked Wu Jiao to research the historical precedents and legal steps required to divorce Empress Wang and elevate a more suitable person to the position of imperial wife. This request was the breakthrough Wu Jiao had been working towards for years. The emperor was not just contemplating her suggestion, he was actively planning to act on it and seeking her help in managing the complex process involved. Her transformation from concubine to empress was no longer a far-off dream. It was becoming an immediate, practical undertaking that would restructure the entire framework of imperial government and Chinese society. However, Wu Jiao also knew that the most challenging and perilous phase of her campaign was just beginning. Persuading Emperor Gaozong was only the initial step in a process that would require her to overcome immense opposition from established court factions, traditional religious bodies, and conservative public opinion throughout the empire. The political and cultural barriers to her unprecedented transformation would challenge every skill she had honed and every alliance she had forged during her remarkable ascent to power. The struggle to become empress would be waged on several fronts at once, demanding that Wu Jiao prove not just her personal abilities, but also her capacity to manage intricate political coalitions and navigate treacherous institutional battles. Success would make her the most powerful woman in Chinese history, but failure would likely lead to the ruin of everything she had worked so tirelessly to build. The stakes were at their absolute highest, and the result would shape not only Wu Jiao's personal destiny, but also the future course of the Tang dynasty and the role of women in Chinese political life for generations to come. The campaign to elevate Wu Jiao to empress commenced in earnest during the spring of 656, and it would become the most intricate political endeavor in the history of the Tang dynasty. Wu Jiao understood that this change required much more than just the emperor's consent. She needed to methodically deconstruct centuries of legal tradition, religious dogma, and social norms that rendered her promotion theoretically impossible. Her initial task was to identify and neutralize the specific sources of resistance that would undoubtedly arise once her ambitions were made public. The most formidable opposition would come from Empress Wang's family, the influential Wang clan, who had staked their political capital and social standing on their daughter's position as the imperial spouse. They would fight fiercely to maintain their influence and stop their adversaries from gaining access to the ultimate source of political authority. Wu Zhao started by conducting a thorough analysis of the Wang family's political connections, charting their alliances, pinpointing their economic interests, and assessing their strategic weaknesses. She found that the clan's influence was built on several foundations that could be strategically weakened. The Wang family held a number of profitable government contracts for military equipment and public works, relationships that brought them great wealth but also created vulnerabilities that could be leveraged. Their power within the imperial bureaucracy was concentrated in particular departments and regions where family members occupied key roles, creating potential pressure points that could be targeted through administrative restructuring. Most importantly, their political alliance included several ambitious figures whose allegiance was based on mutual gain rather than true personal loyalty, making them susceptible to more attractive offers from rival factions. Wu Zhao formulated a multifaceted plan to diminish the Wang clan's capacity to oppose her elevation. She began by finding alternative sources for the government contracts they controlled, proving that their services were not indispensable and that introducing competition could actually enhance quality while lowering expenses. She initiated performance audits in departments where the Wang family's influence was strongest, officially to boost administrative efficiency, but in reality to create openings for replacing their allies with officials who were more aligned with her goals. More subtly, she started to build relationships with younger members of the Wang family who were discontent with their limited career paths within the traditional clan structure. These individuals were presented with opportunities for faster promotions and greater responsibilities in return for their neutrality or even support during the impending succession crisis. Wu Zhao knew that dividing her adversaries was often more effective than attempting to defeat them in a direct clash. While working to weaken the Wang family's political standing, Wu Zhao simultaneously initiated a sophisticated public relations campaign aimed at preparing public sentiment for her unprecedented promotion. This effort required her to tackle the fundamental cultural and religious objections that made the idea of a female ruler seem unthinkable to most Chinese people. The main obstacle was that Confucian political thought expressly forbade women from wielding supreme political power, viewing female rule as a disruption of the natural order that would inevitably result in social disorder and the downfall of the dynasty. Buddhist and Taoist religious traditions, although more adaptable regarding gender roles in some areas, also contain doctrines that were generally understood to support male political supremacy. Wu Zhao needed to find ways to reinterpret these philosophical and religious traditions to support, rather than hinder, her ambitions. Her strategy for this challenge revealed the advanced intellectual preparation she had undertaken during her years of study and observation. Wu Zhao began to sponsor academic research projects that would re-examine classical texts and historical precedents for any evidence supporting female political leadership. She supported conferences and debates among court intellectuals on the correct interpretation of ancient wisdom concerning governance and authority. These scholarly endeavors were carefully framed as legitimate academic investigations rather than politically motivated propaganda. Wu Zhao understood that direct assaults on traditional views would provoke a negative reaction and opposition, but that subtle reinterpretations presented as academic findings might slowly shift the opinions of the educated elite in her favor. The research she funded started to bring to light forgotten historical instances of successful female rulers in China's past, reinterpreting classical works that had traditionally been seen as prohibiting female authority, and formulating new theological arguments about the connection between gender and political legitimacy. These discoveries were circulated through the imperial court and scholarly circles, laying the intellectual groundwork for the acceptance of Wu Jiao's elevation to empress. At the same time, Wu Jiao worked to secure military backing for her campaign, knowing that ultimate political power in imperial China depended on the ability to command armed forces when required. Her years of involvement in strategic planning and military logistics had provided her with extensive contacts among professional officers who prioritized competence over traditional protocol. She began systematically fostering relationships with key military leaders, especially those who had profited from her administrative reforms and policy suggestions. These officers had witnessed firsthand how Wu Jiao's insights enhanced their operational effectiveness, making them more inclined to support her political rise despite potential reservations about gender and tradition. Wu Jiao's method for gaining military support was characteristically practical and focused on results. Instead of seeking abstract loyalty or ideological backing, she concentrated on consistently providing value to military interests through increased funding, better strategic alignment, and more efficient logistical support. Officers who collaborated with her understood that her promotion would likely ensure continued access to her expertise and influence, while her removal could lead to less competent management of military matters. She also started to create contingency plans for potential violent opposition to her promotion, aware that some adversaries might turn to armed rebellion or assassination attempts rather than accept female rule. These preparations involved identifying trustworthy military units that could be called upon to protect the imperial court, setting up secure communication channels for coordinating defenses, and establishing evacuation plans to safeguard her family and key allies if a temporary retreat became necessary. The military aspect of Wu Jiao's campaign was complicated by the need to balance operational security with the necessity of building support networks. Too much preparation could tip off her enemies and incite preemptive strikes, but too little could leave her exposed to sudden violent resistance. She had to strike a delicate balance between transparency with her allies and secrecy from potential foes, a calculation that required constant recalibration as the political landscape shifted. During the summer of 656, Wu Jiao's campaign intensified as Emperor Gaozong started to take concrete measures towards divorcing Empress Wang and formalizing his union with his chosen successor. The emperor's decision to proceed ignited an immediate political crisis that would put every element of Wu Jiao's preparation and strategic foresight to the test. The first major confrontation occurred when senior court officials learned of the emperor's plans and requested formal audiences to voice their dissent. These officials contended that divorcing Empress Wang would breach fundamental principles of imperial dignity and Confucian morality, potentially destabilizing the dynasty and eroding the emperor's legitimacy both at home and abroad. The meetings between Emperor Gaozong and his senior advisors were tense and sometimes hostile, with some officials threatening to resign rather than serve under an empress they deemed illegitimate. The emperor found himself torn between his personal wishes and political calculations on one side, and immense institutional pressure from the established government hierarchy on the other. Wu Jiao was instrumental in helping Emperor Gaozong navigate these confrontations, supplying him with detailed analyses of each official's background, motives, and potential weaknesses. She assisted him in distinguishing between opposition based on genuine principle and that driven by personal or factional interests, which allowed him to tailor his approach to different forms of resistance. For officials whose opposition stemmed from genuine beliefs about proper governmental conduct, Emperor Gaozong stressed the practical advantages that Wu Zhao's elevation would bring to the imperial administration. He pointed to her track record of successful policy contributions and argued that effective governance required him to have the most capable advisors and partners, irrespective of gender. For officials whose resistance appeared to be primarily motivated by factional loyalty or personal ambition, the emperor adopted a more confrontational stance, making it clear that continued opposition would be viewed as disloyalty to the throne and dealt with accordingly. He began reassigning some resistant officials to less significant posts, while promoting others who supported his marriage plans, sending unambiguous signals about the consequences of their political choices. The ecclesiastical aspect of the opposition proved especially difficult because it touched upon fundamental questions about the relationship between imperial power and religious doctrine. Buddhist and Taoist religious leaders argued that promoting Wu Zhao to empress would violate spiritual principles governing the cosmic order, potentially bringing divine retribution upon the entire empire. Wu Zhao's response to the religious opposition demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how spiritual authority functioned in Chinese society. Instead of directly confronting religious leaders, she worked to divide them by promoting alternative interpretations of relevant doctrines and supporting religious figures who were willing to endorse her elevation. She commissioned new translations of Buddhist texts that emphasized compassion and wisdom over gender as the primary qualifications for political leadership. She funded Taoist scholars who argued that the cosmic balance required periodic reversals of traditional patterns, making female rule a necessary correction to excessive male dominance. She supported Confucian intellectuals who reinterpreted classical teachings about governance to focus on competence and virtue rather than gender as the essential requirements for legitimate authority. These religious and philosophical debates created intellectual justification for officials and citizens who were personally inclined to support Wu Biao, but needed a rationale for abandoning traditional beliefs about female political participation. The scholarly discussions provided them with respectable arguments they could use to explain their support for unprecedented changes in imperial protocol. The international implications of Wu Zhao's elevation also required careful management, as neighboring kingdoms and tributary states were closely observing developments in the Tang court for signs of weakness or instability they could exploit. Any perception that the Chinese empire was experiencing internal chaos or had illegitimate leadership could provoke foreign invasions or rebellions in border regions. Wu Zhao addressed these concerns by emphasizing continuity in foreign policy and military readiness. She collaborated with Emperor Gaozong to ensure that diplomatic messages to foreign courts highlighted the stability and strength of the Tang administration, rather than the novel nature of the imperial marriage changes. She coordinated with military commanders to maintain high levels of preparedness along the frontiers, demonstrating that governmental transitions would not create opportunities for external aggression. Her approach to international relations during this period revealed her understanding that foreign perceptions of Chinese strength were as crucial as domestic political support for the success of her elevation. Any sign of weakness or internal division could invite external challenges that would complicate her consolidation of power. By autumn 656, the various components of Wu Zhou's campaign were converging toward a critical juncture where Emperor Gaozong would have to make final decisions about the divorce and remarriage. The political, military, religious, and international groundwork had created a feasible path for her elevation, but the actual execution would still involve navigating immense risks. The timing of the final decision was shaped by several factors beyond Wu Zhou's direct control, which he had foreseen and prepared for. Supporters of Empress Wang were becoming increasingly desperate, making them more likely to attempt drastic actions that could either derail Wu Zhou's campaign or justify its acceleration. Court gossip about the emperor's intentions had reached a level that made it hard to maintain secrecy, creating pressure to either act quickly or abandon the plans. Most importantly, Wu Zhou's own position was becoming more precarious as her enemies realized their time to stop her was running out. The longer she remained in her ambiguous status, the more vulnerable she was to preemptive strikes. This convergence of factors created a situation where inaction was becoming more dangerous than action, compelling Wu Zhou and Emperor Gaozong to speed up their timeline and prepare for the final showdown. The decisive moment came in late 656 when Emperor Gaozong declared his intention to call a formal imperial council to discuss changes to the imperial marriage arrangements. This announcement turned months of clandestine maneuvering into a public political crisis, forcing all parties to openly state their positions and face the repercussions. Wu Zhou knew this council meeting would be the culmination of over a decade of work. Success would make her empress and give her unprecedented power to reshape Chinese society. Failure would almost certainly mean her exile or execution, along with the ruin of all her supporters. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome hinged on her ability to manage complex political dynamics under immense pressure while maintaining the facade of humble deference still required of women in imperial Chinese society. She would need to be both bold and subtle, confident and deferential, commanding and respectful as she navigated the most significant political performance of her extraordinary life. The imperial council that was to decide Wu Zhou's future convened on a cold December morning in 656, with representatives from every major faction in the Chinese government assembling in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The symbolism was clear. Wu Zhou's elevation would either be recorded as a legitimate extension of imperial tradition or denounced as a perilous violation of fundamental governmental principles. Everything now rested on her ability to persuade the assembled officials, military leaders, and religious figures that her unprecedented transformation was not a revolutionary departure, but a natural and necessary evolution. The woman who had entered the imperial court as a powerless teenager was about to find out if her intelligence, ambition, and political skills were enough to achieve the impossible. The Imperial Council gathered in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, a venue where the most critical decisions in Chinese imperial history had been made for generations. Wu Zhou had prepared meticulously, but she knew no amount of planning could fully ready her for the unprecedented task she was undertaking. The assembled officials represented a complete cross-section of Tang dynasty power, each group with its own perspectives. Military commanders sat with Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks debated with Taoist priests, and provincial governors conversed with court bureaucrats. This diversity ensured every argument for and against Wu Zhou's elevation would be thoroughly explored. Emperor Gaozong began the proceedings with a carefully worded speech emphasizing the practical difficulties facing the administration and the need for new solutions. He deliberately avoided mentioning Wu Zhou by name, focusing instead on abstract principles about selecting the most qualified individuals for vital roles, regardless of tradition. The emperor's strategy was sound but risky. By framing the debate around efficiency, he invited intense scrutiny of Wu Zhou's qualifications. This examination could either confirm her claims of exceptional ability or reveal weaknesses for her enemies to exploit. The first part of the council's debates centered on historical precedents for imperial marriages and the legal protocols for altering the imperial family structure. Conservative officials argued that established traditions existed for valid reasons and should not be changed without a compelling justification that outweighed the risks to dynastic stability. Wu Zhao's supporters countered by presenting the scholarly research she had sponsored, showing that imperial marriage customs had evolved throughout Chinese history in response to changing political needs. They argued that adaptability and flexibility were in fact traditional imperial virtues, not dangerous new ideas. The historical discussion highlighted the sophisticated intellectual groundwork Wu Jiao had laid to support her candidacy. Her research team had found numerous instances of emperors modifying marriage arrangements for political or administrative purposes, establishing precedents that could be used to justify the current proposed changes. More importantly, they had found classical texts that could be interpreted to support the meritocratic selection of imperial spouses based on capability rather than birthright or custom. The second part of the council's discussions tackled the practical effects of Wu Jiao's promotion on imperial administration and government performance. This topic was her strong suit, as she had spent years proving her administrative skill and policy acumen through tangible contributions to successful government projects. Military commanders testified about Wu Jiao's valuable input on strategic planning and logistics, citing specific instances where her advice had improved operational results and cut costs. Provincial governors explained how her economic knowledge had helped them enact more effective tax collection and agricultural development initiatives. Court officials conceded her superior grasp of bureaucratic processes and interfactional dynamics. This testimony was especially persuasive because it came from hands-on administrators who had worked directly with Wu Jiao and could attest to her abilities from personal experience. Their endorsements held more sway than abstract, theoretical arguments because they were based on documented successes, not speculation. However, Wu Jiao's adversaries also presented strong arguments about the dangers of her promotion. They contended that elevating a woman to empress would create hazardous precedents that could destabilize traditional social structures and foster inappropriate ambitions in other women throughout the empire. They warned that foreign kingdoms might see female rule as a sign of Chinese vulnerability and become more aggressive in their territorial ambitions. The religious aspect of the opposition was particularly difficult as it involved fundamental questions of cosmic order and divine sanction for governmental structures. Buddhist leaders contended that elevating Wu Jiao would breach principles concerning the proper balance of masculine and feminine energies that governed both the spiritual and political worlds. Confucian scholars asserted that female rule was contrary to natural law and would inevitably result in social chaos and the fall of the dynasty. Wu Jiao's handling of these religious objections showed her sophisticated grasp of how spiritual authority operated in imperial politics. Instead of directly challenging established doctrines, she worked through allied religious figures to offer alternative interpretations that supported her candidacy while showing respect for traditional teachings. The Buddhist monks she had cultivated argued that compassion and wisdom were more critical than gender for effective leadership, citing examples from Buddhist scriptures of female figures who had attained enlightenment and guided entire communities. The Taoist priests in her coalition stressed concepts of balance and transformation, suggesting that occasional reversals of traditional patterns were needed to maintain cosmic harmony. The Confucian scholars she supported concentrated on classical teachings about virtue and competence as the primary qualifications for legitimate authority. These religious discussions provided an opening for officials who were personally inclined to support Wu Jiao, but needed an intellectual basis for abandoning conventional beliefs about female political roles. The scholarly debates gave them respectable arguments to justify their support for unprecedented changes in imperial protocol without appearing to reject core cultural values. The third phase of the council addressed the international repercussions of Wu Jiao's promotion and the potential reactions from neighboring kingdoms and tributary states. This discussion was crucial because any perception of Chinese weakness could trigger foreign invasions or border rebellions that might destabilize the entire empire. Wu Jiao had prepared extensively for this line of inquiry by coordinating with military commanders and diplomatic officials to develop thorough assessments of foreign threats and appropriate responses. She was able to display a detailed knowledge of international affairs and strategic planning that impressed even skeptical officials who had doubted her qualifications for imperial duties. Her analysis of foreign policy challenges showed an understanding that far surpassed what most court officials knew about the complex relationships with Korean kingdoms, Turkic tribes, and Central Asian trade partners. She could discuss military logistics, economic dependencies, and cultural factors influencing diplomatic talks with a sophistication that reflected years of serious study and hands-on experience. More importantly, Wu Jiao presented specific proposals for strengthening China's international standing that addressed valid concerns about potential foreign exploitation of the imperial transition. Her recommendations included military reforms, diplomatic overtures, and economic policies that would project imperial strength and continuity regardless of changes in domestic political arrangements. The international policy debates also gave Wu Jiao opportunities to showcase her unique qualifications for managing complex governmental issues that demanded both analytical intellect and practical administrative skill. She was able to prove that her promotion would strengthen, rather than weaken, Chinese capabilities in dealing with foreign threats and opportunities. As the council debate stretched over several days, the political landscape became increasingly clear to all involved. Wu Jiao had successfully forged a coalition of military leaders, provincial administrators, younger court officials, and allied religious figures who backed her candidacy based on proven competence and practical advantages. Her opposition consisted mainly of conservative aristocratic families, traditional religious authorities, and older bureaucrats who valued conventional procedures over innovative governance. The numerical strength of these factions was roughly balanced, meaning the final outcome would hinge on the stance of moderate officials who were genuinely undecided. These individuals were primarily concerned with preserving imperial stability and effectiveness, rather than promoting any particular ideology or faction. Wu Jiao's strategy to win over the moderates was to emphasize continuity and gradual reform, not revolutionary upheaval. She framed her promotion as a natural progression of existing imperial practices, rather than a radical departure from tradition. She underscored her commitment to working within established governmental frameworks while making incremental improvements to administrative efficiency and policy effectiveness. This approach was calculated to reassure moderate officials that supporting her candidacy would not require them to forsake their fundamental beliefs about proper governance or social order. Wu Jiao aimed to be seen as a competent administrator who happened to be female, rather than a feminist revolutionary using her gender to challenge traditional power structures. The final day of the council featured direct testimony from Wu Jiao herself, giving her a chance to personally present her case to the assembled officials. This was an unprecedented event in Chinese imperial history, as no woman had ever before addressed a formal governmental council on matters of such fundamental importance to the dynasty. Wu Jiao's presentation was masterfully executed to address every major concern raised during the debates while showcasing the intelligence, dignity, and administrative skill that justified her historic elevation. She began by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of her candidacy and expressing profound respect for the traditions that had guided Chinese governance for centuries. From this foundation of humility, she methodically built a persuasive argument for why contemporary challenges necessitated innovative solutions that expanded upon, rather than discarded, traditional wisdom. Wu Zhao emphasized that her administrative experience and policy knowledge were assets that could fortify the imperial government and better serve the Chinese people. She addressed religious objections by demonstrating a sophisticated grasp of Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian doctrines, while offering interpretations that supported her candidacy. Her theological arguments were carefully constructed to respect established beliefs while highlighting alternative readings that prioritized competence and virtue over gender. Wu Zhao's discussion of international relations revealed a detailed understanding of foreign policy issues and specific plans for maintaining Chinese strength and influence abroad. She successfully demonstrated that her elevation would enhance, not diminish, the empire's ability to handle external threats and opportunities. Most importantly, Wu Zhao presented a comprehensive vision for imperial administration that stressed continuity with established procedures while integrating innovations to improve governmental effectiveness. Her proposals were practical and concrete, not abstract or ideological, showing that she had given serious consideration to the actual duties and challenges of imperial rule. Her testimony concluded with a direct appeal to the assembled officials to support her based on proven competence and potential contributions to the empire's success, rather than on abstract notions about traditional gender roles. She argued that effective governance depended on selecting the most qualified individuals for crucial roles, regardless of precedent. Her presentation was followed by further questions from council members seeking clarification on various aspects of her background, qualifications, and policy ideas. These exchanges provided Wu Zhao with more opportunities to display her knowledge and administrative abilities, while assuaging any remaining doubts about her suitability for imperial duties. The questioning period revealed the depth of preparation Wu Zhao had undertaken for this pivotal moment in her career. She was able to provide detailed answers to technical questions about military strategy, economic policy, administrative processes, and diplomatic relations that impressed even skeptical officials. More importantly, her responses showcased the analytical intelligence and practical wisdom that had made her such an effective advisor to Emperor Gaozong, allowing officials to see firsthand the capabilities that made him consider her partnership essential for successful rule. After 5 days of intense deliberation, the Imperial Council concluded its sessions and prepared to submit its recommendations to Emperor Gaozong. The final vote was narrower than her supporters had wished, but it was sufficient to provide the political legitimacy needed to proceed with the unprecedented changes to the imperial marriage. The council's formal recommendation highlighted Wu Zhao's proven administrative competence and policy insights, while acknowledging the novel nature of her elevation and the importance of careful implementation to preserve stability. The document gave Emperor Gaozong the political justification he needed to move forward while setting expectations for how the transition would be handled. Wu Zhao's reaction to the council's verdict was characteristically controlled and strategic. She expressed appropriate gratitude for the trust placed in her, while stressing her dedication to serving the empire's interests and maintaining governmental stability during the transition. Her public declarations were carefully worded to reassure moderate supporters and avoid any sense of triumph that might provoke renewed opposition from the defeated factions. The immediate period following the council's decision brought new challenges and opportunities that would test Wu Zhao's ability to consolidate her victory and begin transforming her formal promotion into effective political power. Success in the council debates was merely the first step in a much longer process of establishing herself as a legitimate and effective empress who could command respect and obedience from government institutions across the empire. The implementation phase would demand that Wu Zhao prove her elevation was beneficial for the administration and Chinese society, not just a personal victory for her own ambitions. She would need to deliver on the promises made during the council proceedings, while navigating the complex political dynamics created by her unprecedented transformation from concubine to empress. However, Wu Zhao had spent over a decade preparing for precisely these challenges, and she possessed the intelligence, experience, and political skills necessary to succeed where no woman in Chinese history had ever been given the chance to try. Her remarkable journey from a powerless teenager to a potential empress was about to enter its most critical phase as she sought to convert unprecedented formal authority into the practical power needed to reshape an empire according to her extraordinary vision. The winter of 657 would decide whether Wu Zhao's elevation marked the beginning of a new era in Chinese political history or was merely an ambitious experiment destined for failure and disgrace. Everything she had strived for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had achieved now hinged on her ability to prove that a woman could not only survive at the pinnacle of imperial power, but could excel in ways that would benefit the entire empire. The teenage concubine who had entered the Forbidden City with only her intellect and resolve was about to find out if those qualities were enough to succeed in the ultimate test of political leadership in the most powerful empire on earth. The formal ceremony declaring Wu Zhao as Empress Wu was held on a cold January morning in 657, turning the Hall of Supreme Harmony into the setting for the most revolutionary event in Chinese imperial history. The intricate ritual was meticulously arranged to stress continuity with traditional customs, while subtly acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the occasion. Hundreds of court officials, military leaders, and foreign envoys filled the magnificent hall, their silk garments forming a vibrant tapestry against the backdrop of gold pillars and jade ornaments. The ceremony itself adhered to ancient protocols used for imperial weddings throughout Chinese history, yet everyone in attendance knew they were witnessing something that had never occurred before and might never happen again. Emperor Gaozong, magnificent in his dragon robes and ceremonial headwear, formally announced Wu Zhao as his empress and partner in ruling the Tang Empire. The words resonated through the hall with an authority that made the extraordinary seem inevitable, transforming months of political conflict into historical reality through the power of an imperial decree. Success in the council debates was merely the first step in a much longer process of establishing herself as a legitimate and effective empress who could command respect and obedience from government institutions across the empire. The implementation phase would demand that Wu Zhao prove her elevation was beneficial for the administration and Chinese society, not just a personal victory for her own ambitions. She would need to deliver on the promises made during the council proceedings, while navigating the complex political dynamics created by her unprecedented transformation from concubine to empress. However, Wu Zhao had spent over a decade preparing for precisely these challenges, and she possessed the intelligence, experience, and political skills necessary to succeed where no woman in Chinese history had ever been given the chance to try. Her remarkable journey from a powerless teenager to a potential empress was about to enter its most critical phase as she sought to convert unprecedented formal authority into the practical power needed to reshape an empire according to her extraordinary vision. The winter of 657 would decide whether Wu Zhao's elevation marked the beginning of a new era in Chinese political history or was merely an ambitious experiment destined for failure and disgrace. Everything she had strived for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had achieved now hinged on her ability to prove that a woman could not only survive at the pinnacle of imperial power, but could excel in ways that would benefit the entire empire. The teenage concubine who had entered the Forbidden City with only her intellect and resolve was about to find out if those qualities were enough to succeed in the ultimate test of political leadership in the most powerful empire on earth. The formal ceremony declaring Wu Zhao as Empress Wu was held on a cold January morning in 657, turning the Hall of Supreme Harmony into the setting for the most revolutionary event in Chinese imperial history. The intricate ritual was meticulously arranged to stress continuity with traditional customs, while subtly acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the occasion. Hundreds of court officials, military leaders, and foreign envoys filled the magnificent hall, their silk garments forming a vibrant tapestry against the backdrop of gold pillars and jade ornaments. The ceremony itself adhered to ancient protocols used for imperial weddings throughout Chinese history, yet everyone in attendance knew they were witnessing something that had never occurred before and might never happen again. Emperor Gaozong, magnificent in his dragon robes and ceremonial headwear, formally announced Wu Zhao as his empress and partner in ruling the Tang Empire. The words resonated through the hall with an authority that made the extraordinary seem inevitable, transforming months of political conflict into historical reality through the power of an imperial decree. Wu Zhao, now Empress Wu, accepted the golden phoenix crown and jade seal, symbolizing her new rank, with perfect dignity and poise. Her acceptance speech was concise and carefully worded to convey her gratitude, humility, and dedication to serving the empire's interests. She made no mention of the exceptional nature of her promotion or the resistance she had overcome to achieve it. However, beneath the ceremonial propriety, everyone present understood the significance of what had just transpired. A woman who had entered the imperial court as a powerless concubine had methodically transformed herself into the most influential person in the Chinese empire, second only to the emperor himself. Her promotion represented not just a personal victory, but a fundamental challenge to the assumptions about gender, power, and political authority that had governed Chinese society for over a millennium. The immediate aftermath of the coronation revealed both the opportunities and the dangers that Empress Wu would face in her new role. Congratulations arrived from officials and military commanders who had backed her candidacy, but these expressions of loyalty were often paired with requests for favors and appointments that reflected their expectations of imperial gratitude. More forebodingly, several prominent court officials who had opposed her promotion submitted formal requests for retirement or reassignment to distant provincial posts, signaling their refusal to serve under female authority despite the emperor's clear endorsement. These resignations created immediate administrative voids, while also giving Empress Wu the chance to replace potentially disloyal subordinates with officials more committed to her cause. The international reaction to Wu Zhao's promotion was varied, but generally cautious, reflecting foreign uncertainty about how this unprecedented event might affect Chinese military strength and diplomatic ties. Korean kingdoms postponed planned tribute missions as they assessed whether female rule indicated a weakness in China that could be exploited. Turkic tribal leaders intensified raids along the northern border, probing imperial resolve under the new leadership. These foreign challenges demanded immediate and firm responses that would demonstrate the continuity of Chinese power regardless of changes within the imperial family. Empress Wu knew that any sign of weakness or indecision could spark a broader international crisis that would weaken her domestic political standing and potentially threaten the empire's security. Her response to these challenges showcased the strategic insight and administrative skill that had facilitated her incredible rise. Instead of permitting military commanders to act independently in response to foreign provocations, Empress Wu orchestrated a comprehensive strategy that merged diplomatic efforts with precisely measured military actions aimed at discouraging aggression while preventing unnecessary escalation. She personally reviewed intelligence on foreign military movements, consulted with veteran generals on suitable countermeasures, and composed diplomatic dispatches that underscored Chinese determination while allowing potential adversaries a way to retreat without losing face. This direct involvement in foreign policy management proved her genuine grasp of strategic planning and asserted her authority over the military and diplomatic establishments. The Korean situation was especially sensitive, involving complex historical ties and rival territorial claims that could easily spiral into a full-scale war if handled poorly. Several Korean kingdoms had been vassals of the Chinese Empire for generations, offering tribute and military aid in return for protection and trade benefits. However, the ascension of a female empress had created doubt about whether these agreements would hold under the new leadership. Empress Wu's approach to the Korean issue was characteristically sophisticated and multifaceted. She began by sending seasoned diplomats to Korean courts with personal messages that reaffirmed her commitment to traditional relationships, while also hinting at potential rewards for kingdoms that showed continued loyalty. These diplomatic overtures were supported by discreet military preparations that would allow for the rapid deployment of Chinese forces if diplomacy failed. More importantly, she used the Korean situation to showcase her strategic talents to domestic audiences, who were still assessing her qualifications for imperial rule. By successfully managing intricate international negotiations while upholding imperial dignity and Chinese interests, Empress Wu could demonstrate that female leadership was not only viable but potentially superior to conventional methods that relied mainly on military force. The Turkic frontier posed different but equally significant challenges that demanded a careful balance of competing priorities and limited resources. Turkic tribal confederations had been launching increasingly bold raids into Chinese territory, testing imperial defenses and looking for opportunities to establish permanent footholds in border areas. These incursions threatened both Chinese security and imperial prestige, requiring responses that would deter future aggression without sparking larger conflicts that could deplete imperial resources. Empress Wu's strategy for addressing the Turkic threats combined military, diplomatic, and economic measures that reflected her comprehensive understanding of the factors driving tribal actions. She recognized that the Turkic raids were primarily fueled by economic hardship rather than territorial ambition, which created openings for solutions that addressed the root causes instead of just reacting to the immediate symptoms. Her approach started with enhanced intelligence gathering about tribal leadership, internal disputes, and resource needs that might be influencing their decisions to raid Chinese territory. This information allowed for more precise responses that could exploit divisions among different tribal groups while offering incentives for cooperation with Chinese authorities. Simultaneously, Empress Wu launched economic programs designed to provide Turkic tribes with legitimate alternatives to raiding for income and resources. These initiatives included expanded trade opportunities, employment in Chinese military units, and access to Chinese agricultural methods that could improve tribal food security. The programs were carefully designed to foster dependencies that would discourage future aggression, while showcasing Chinese generosity and strength. The military component of her Turkic strategy prioritized mobility, intelligence, and psychological warfare over massive troop deployments, which would be costly and potentially ineffective. Empress Wu collaborated with experienced frontier commanders to create new tactics that could counter Turkic advantages in cavalry combat while leveraging Chinese superiority in logistics, coordination, and technology. These military innovations included improved communication systems for faster responses, enhanced fortification designs to withstand cavalry assaults, and new weapon technologies that gave Chinese forces a tactical edge. The success of Empress Wu's foreign policy initiatives during her first months as empress provided powerful proof of her competence, which helped solidify her domestic political standing. Officials who had doubted her qualifications found it increasingly difficult to sustain their opposition when her policies were yielding tangible improvements in imperial security and international standing. More importantly, her foreign policy triumphs created opportunities for Empress Wu to begin enacting domestic reforms that would strengthen her political coalition and tackle long-standing issues in Chinese governance. The credibility she earned from effectively managing international crises gave her the political capital needed for more controversial domestic projects. The first major area of domestic reform that Empress Wu tackled was the imperial bureaucracy itself, which had become increasingly controlled by a small number of aristocratic families whose members inherited government posts regardless of their competence or merit. This system fostered inefficiency and corruption, which weakened governmental effectiveness and restricted opportunities for talented individuals from diverse backgrounds. Empress Wu's approach to bureaucratic reform was gradual and strategic, designed to improve administrative performance while avoiding a direct clash with established families whose opposition could destabilize her political position. She began by expanding the examination systems that allowed individuals to qualify for government service based on demonstrated knowledge and abilities, rather than family connections or aristocratic birth. These examination reforms were framed as efforts to strengthen the imperial administration by ensuring that the most qualified candidates were chosen for important roles. The changes appeared to be driven by a concern for governmental efficiency, rather than a desire to challenge traditional social hierarchies, making them more acceptable to conservative officials who might otherwise resist innovations that threatened established privileges. The expanded examination system opened new doors for individuals from merchant, artisan, and farming families to enter government service, gradually diversifying the social makeup of the imperial bureaucracy. This diversification bolstered Empress Wu's political coalition by creating a class of officials who owed their positions to her reforms, not to traditional aristocratic networks. More subtly, the examination reforms enabled Empress Wu to identify and promote talented individuals who were likely to be personally loyal to her because their career progression depended on her continued support. These officials formed the core of a new administrative elite that was more meritocratic and less constrained by traditional factional allegiances than the existing bureaucratic establishment. The second major area of domestic reform addressed economic policies affecting agricultural production, commercial growth, and tax collection across the empire. The existing system had evolved over centuries to benefit large landowners and established merchant families, often to the detriment of small farmers and independent traders who constituted the majority of the Chinese population. Empress Wu recognized that economic reforms could simultaneously increase imperial revenues, build popular support for her government, and diminish the political influence of aristocratic families whose power was largely derived from their control over land and trade networks. However, implementing such reforms required meticulous planning and phased execution to prevent economic turmoil that could destabilize the entire empire. Her economic strategy commenced with infrastructure improvements that would benefit all social classes while creating new avenues for government supervision of commercial activities. These projects included expanding the canal network connecting different regions, building new roads to facilitate trade, and developing standardized currency systems to simplify transactions and tax collection. The infrastructure programs were popular with merchants and farmers who gained from lower transportation costs and greater market access, while also giving Empress Wu legitimate reasons to place government officials in positions to monitor economic activities and enforce imperial policies. This oversight would be crucial for enacting more controversial reforms that redistributed economic opportunities and political influence. At the same time, Empress Wu started to test new approaches to agricultural taxation that eased the burden on small farmers while making sure that large landowners contributed their fair share to imperial revenues. These tax reforms were presented as measures to improve collection efficiency and lower administrative costs, rather than as attempts to redistribute wealth or challenge the existing social order. The agricultural tax experiments were initially carried out in select provinces where Empress Wu had strong political backing and dependable administrative staff who could implement complex new procedures without provoking significant opposition. The outcomes of these pilot programs provided valuable data on the practical effects of different policy approaches while showcasing the potential benefits of more extensive reforms. The success of the pilot programs emboldened Empress Wu to extend agricultural tax reforms to other provinces, while also beginning to address commercial taxation policies that impacted merchants and artisans. These commercial reforms were designed to foster economic development and innovation while ensuring that imperial revenues kept pace with the growing importance of trade and manufacturing in the Chinese economy. The third major area of domestic reform involved legal and judicial processes that governed how disputes were settled and criminal cases were handled throughout the empire. The existing legal system was intricate and often inconsistent, with different procedures for different social classes and types of cases. This complexity created openings for corruption and manipulation, making it difficult for ordinary citizens to understand their rights and duties under imperial law. Empress Wu's approach to legal reform prioritized standardization, transparency, and accessibility over fundamental changes to the principles of Chinese jurisprudence. She aimed to make the legal system more efficient and equitable without challenging the basic assumptions about imperial authority or social hierarchy that formed the foundation of governmental legitimacy. The legal reforms started with comprehensive reviews of existing laws and procedures to pinpoint inconsistencies, redundancies, and gaps that led to confusion or abuse. These reviews were conducted by teams of scholars and experienced judges tasked with developing recommendations for improvements that would enhance both fairness and efficiency in legal proceedings. The review process uncovered numerous issues with existing legal procedures that were eroding public trust in imperial justice and creating administrative burdens that consumed excessive government resources. Many laws were obsolete or conflicting, enforcement practices varied greatly between regions, and appeal processes were so convoluted that only the wealthy could effectively contest unfavorable rulings. Empress Wu's response to these problems was a systematic revision of the legal codes to eliminate contradictions and simplify procedures while maintaining appropriate safeguards for both individual rights and imperial authority. The revised codes were intended to be more understandable to common citizens while also giving clearer instructions to judges and administrative officials on proper procedures and penalties. The legal reforms also included enhancements to judicial training and evaluation systems to ensure more consistent application of laws across the empire. Judges were required to demonstrate proficiency in both legal knowledge and practical decision-making before being appointed to significant posts, while regular performance reviews ensured that judicial officials upheld appropriate standards of competence and integrity. These judicial improvements were particularly important for Empress Wu's political position because they showcased her commitment to fairness and good governance while also creating systems that could protect her allies from politically motivated prosecutions by hostile officials. The reformed legal system offered both practical advantages for Chinese citizens and strategic benefits for maintaining her political coalition. The fourth major area of domestic reform focused on military organization and strategic planning systems, which were vital for maintaining imperial security and supporting foreign policy goals. The existing military structure had evolved over centuries to meet various threats, resulting in a complex system of overlapping commands and competing priorities that sometimes impeded effective responses to contemporary security issues. Empress Wu's military reforms were designed to improve coordination among different military units while preserving the regional autonomy that enabled swift responses to local threats. She understood that excessive centralization could create vulnerabilities if communication lines were cut, but also recognized that insufficient coordination could prevent effective responses to large-scale challenges requiring integrated strategies. Her approach to military reform began with thorough assessments of existing capabilities, threat environments, and resource needs to provide an accurate picture of the strengths and weaknesses in the imperial defense systems. These assessments were carried out by experienced military professionals who could offer objective evaluations without being influenced by factional politics or personal agendas. The military assessments identified both significant strengths and major vulnerabilities in Chinese defense systems that needed immediate attention. Imperial forces were generally well-equipped and professionally trained, but coordination between different commands was often lacking, and strategic planning was sometimes compromised by political considerations that interfered with sound military judgment. Empress Wu's response to these military challenges involved gradual improvements to command structures, communication systems, and strategic planning processes that would enhance effectiveness without causing disruption during the reform period. The military reforms were implemented carefully to maintain operational readiness while upgrading capabilities and addressing identified weaknesses. The military improvements included new training programs that emphasized coordination between different types of units, enhanced intelligence systems that provided better information about potential threats, and improved logistics capabilities that could support more complex operations over greater distances. These reforms strengthen Chinese military capabilities while also creating new opportunities for talented officers to advance based on demonstrated competence rather than political connections. More importantly, the military reforms established Empress Wu's authority over the imperial armed forces in ways that would be essential for maintaining her political position against potential challenges from domestic opponents or foreign enemies. Military commanders who benefited from her reforms became stakeholders in her continued success, creating powerful incentives for loyalty and support during future political crises. The cumulative effect of Empress Wu's domestic reforms during her first year as empress was to strengthen both the practical effectiveness of the imperial government and her personal political position within the complex hierarchy of Chinese power structures. Each reform area reinforced the others, creating synergistic improvements that demonstrated the benefits of a comprehensive rather than piecemeal approach to governmental innovation. The bureaucratic reforms improved administrative efficiency while creating new sources of political support among officials whose careers benefited from expanded opportunities for advancement. The economic reforms strengthened imperial revenues while building popular support among farmers and merchants who experienced tangible improvements in their economic circumstances. The legal reforms enhanced public confidence in imperial justice while providing protections for Empress Wu's political coalition. The military reforms strengthened imperial security while establishing her authority over the armed forces. These interconnected improvements provided powerful evidence that female leadership could not only function effectively within Chinese governmental systems, but could actually produce superior results compared to traditional approaches that relied primarily on precedent and conventional wisdom. The practical success of her policies made it increasingly difficult for opponents to argue that her elevation had been a mistake or that traditional gendered restrictions should be restored. However, Empress Wu also understood that her reforms were creating new sources of opposition among individuals and groups whose interests were threatened by changes in existing systems. Aristocratic families were losing some of their traditional privileges. Conservative officials were uncomfortable with innovative approaches to governance, and some military commanders resented new oversight procedures that limited their autonomy. Managing this opposition while continuing to implement necessary reforms required Empress Wu to demonstrate both strength and flexibility in her approach to political leadership. She needed to show that resistance to her policies would be futile, while also providing face-saving opportunities for opponents who were willing to accept the new political realities she was creating. Her strategy for managing political opposition involved a combination of incentives and deterrents that were carefully calibrated to encourage cooperation while discouraging organized resistance. Officials who supported her reforms were rewarded with promotions, increased responsibilities, and access to imperial favor. Those who opposed her policies faced reduced influence, unfavorable assignments, and exclusion from important decision-making processes. More subtly, Empress Wu began using her expanding intelligence networks to gather information about potential conspiracies or organized opposition activities that might threaten her political position or the stability of her reforms. This intelligence capability allowed her to identify problems before they became serious threats, while also demonstrating to potential opponents that resistance would be detected and countered. The intelligence systems she developed were more sophisticated and comprehensive than anything previous Chinese rulers had employed, reflecting both her understanding of the unique challenges she faced as a female emperor and her recognition that maintaining power required constant vigilance against potential threats from multiple directions simultaneously. These intelligence capabilities would prove essential as Empress Wu's reforms began to generate the types of organized opposition that had destroyed previous attempts at governmental innovation in Chinese history. The combination of aristocratic resentment, conservative resistance, and foreign exploitation of domestic instability had toppled numerous dynasties and emperors who had attempted changes similar to those she was implementing. However, Empress Wu possessed advantages that previous reformers had lacked, including unprecedented popular support, military loyalty, and administrative competence that enabled her to anticipate and counter threats that might otherwise have proven fatal to her political survival. The intelligence networks, reformed bureaucracy, strengthened military, and improved legal system created multiple layers of protection that would be tested repeatedly during the challenging years ahead. The winter of 658 marked the end of Empress Wu's first full year in power and the beginning of a new phase in her remarkable political career. She had successfully consolidated her authority, implemented significant reforms, and demonstrated that female leadership could produce exceptional results in governing the world's largest and most complex empire. But the teenage concubine, who had systematically transformed herself into China's most powerful woman, understood that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The reforms she had implemented were beginning to generate organized opposition that would require all her intelligence, experience, and political skill to overcome. The question was no longer whether a woman could succeed as empress, but whether even someone as extraordinary as Wu Zetian could maintain power against the forces that were gathering to destroy everything she had accomplished. The answer to that question would determine not only her personal fate, but the future direction of Chinese civilization and the role of women in political leadership for centuries to come. Everything she had learned during her incredible rise from powerless concubine to supreme authority was about to be tested in ways that would either establish her as one of history's greatest rulers or serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of individual ambition in traditional societies. The stage was set for the next phase of Wu Zetian's extraordinary journey, as the woman who had achieved the impossible prepared to discover whether her remarkable accomplishments could survive the ultimate test of sustained political leadership in the face of determined opposition from the most powerful forces in Chinese society. The years that followed would test every strategy Wu Zetian had mastered during her ascent to power, as the forces arrayed against her began to coalesce into organized resistance that threatened not just her reforms, but her very survival as emperor. By 659, the whispers in palace corridors had grown into open discussions among aristocratic families about the necessity of restoring traditional order to the empire, and these discussions were beginning to take on the character of conspiracy. The challenge Wu Zetian faced was fundamentally different from anything she had encountered during her rise to power. Previously, she had been fighting for advancement within existing systems, using her intelligence and political skills to navigate established hierarchies and win allies among people who already held positions of authority. Now, as emperor, she was simultaneously defending her position while trying to transform the very systems that had enabled her success. The aristocratic families who formed the core of opposition to her rule were not simply resisting individual policies or administrative changes, they were fighting to preserve a social order that had guaranteed their wealth, status, and political influence for generations. Wu Zetian's reforms threatened to replace hereditary privilege with merit-based advancement, undermining the fundamental assumptions about power and authority that these families had built their entire identities around. The Zhou family, one of the most prominent aristocratic clans in the empire, began organizing what they called study groups to discuss classical texts and traditional governance principles. These gatherings, held in elegant private mansions throughout Chang'an, attracted dozens of court officials, retired generals, and influential scholars who shared concerns about the direction of imperial policy under female leadership. On the surface, these meetings appeared to be innocent intellectual discussions about Confucian philosophy and historical precedents for proper governmental procedures. The participants carefully avoided direct criticism of Wu Zetian or explicit calls for resistance to her authority. Instead, they focused on abstract principles about natural order, traditional values, and the importance of maintaining continuity with ancestral wisdom. However, beneath this facade of scholarly inquiry, the study groups were developing coordinated strategies for undermining Wu Zetian's reforms and eventually forcing her removal from power. The participants shared information about government policies, coordinated their responses to imperial initiatives, and began identifying potential military commanders who might support a restoration of traditional male leadership. Wu Zetian's intelligence networks detected these activities within weeks of their inception, providing her with detailed information about the participants, their discussions, and their evolving plans for organized resistance. The reports she received revealed not just the immediate threat posed by aristocratic opposition, but also the sophisticated nature of their approach to challenging her authority. Rather than attempting direct confrontation or open rebellion, which would have played to Wu Zetian's strengths in managing political crises, her opponents were pursuing a strategy of gradual erosion designed to weaken her position over time while maintaining plausible deniability about their ultimate objectives. This approach was more dangerous than outright revolt because it was harder to counter without appearing paranoid or authoritarian. Wu Zetian's response to this emerging threat demonstrated both her political maturity and her understanding of the complex dynamics involved in maintaining imperial authority. She recognized that aggressive action against the study groups could backfire by providing her opponents with evidence that she was becoming a tyrant who suppressed legitimate intellectual discourse. But she also understood that allowing organized opposition to develop unchecked could eventually lead to challenges that would be much more difficult to overcome. Her solution involved a multi-layered strategy that combined subtle countermeasures with proactive initiatives designed to strengthen her position while weakening her opponents. She began by expanding her own networks of scholars and intellectuals who could provide alternative interpretations of the classical texts that aristocratic opponents were using to justify their resistance to her reforms. The scholarly initiatives Wu Zetian sponsored were carefully designed to appear as legitimate academic research rather than political propaganda. She funded conferences and publications that explored historical examples of successful governmental innovation, re-examined traditional teachings about leadership and authority, and developed new frameworks for understanding the relationship between effective governance and social change. These intellectual projects served multiple purposes in Wu Zetian's broader strategy for managing aristocratic opposition. They provided her supporters with sophisticated arguments that could counter the classical quotations and historical precedents that her opponents used to justify their resistance to her reforms. They created opportunities for talented scholars to advance their careers by contributing to imperial initiatives, building loyalty among intellectual communities that might otherwise have been neutral or hostile. Most importantly, the scholarly projects established Wu Zetian as a patron of learning and cultural development, countering attempts to portray her as an illegitimate usurper who is destroying traditional Chinese civilization. Her support for intellectual inquiry and academic excellence demonstrated that her reforms were motivated by genuine concern for imperial welfare rather than personal ambition or revolutionary ideology. Simultaneously, Wu Zetian began implementing more targeted measures designed to disrupt the coordination mechanisms that aristocratic families were using to organize their opposition. These measures were subtle and indirect, designed to appear as routine administrative adjustments rather than deliberate attempts to suppress political resistance. She initiated a series of bureaucratic reforms that required more frequent reporting and documentation of official activities, making it more difficult for government employees to participate in unauthorized political discussions without detection. New assignment procedures rotated officials between different departments and regions more frequently, preventing the formation of stable factional networks that could coordinate opposition activities over extended periods. Travel regulations were modified to require additional documentation and approval processes for journeys between major cities, making it more challenging for aristocratic families to maintain regular communication and coordination across different regions of the empire. These changes were presented as security measures, designed to improve intelligence gathering about foreign threats, but they had the practical effect of limiting the ability of domestic opponents to organize large-scale resistance. The financial dimension of Wu Zetian's counter-strategy involved careful manipulation of government contracts, tax assessments, and trade privileges that affected the economic interests of aristocratic families. Rather than direct attacks on their wealth, which would have been obvious and potentially counterproductive, she implemented gradual changes that reduced their economic advantages while creating new opportunities for individuals and families who supported her reforms. Government procurement procedures were modified to emphasize competitive bidding and performance standards rather than traditional relationships and family connections. Tax collection methods were standardized to reduce opportunities for preferential treatment based on aristocratic status. Trading privileges and commercial licenses were expanded to include more diverse applicants, reducing the monopolistic advantages that established families had enjoyed for generations. These economic measures were presented as efforts to improve governmental efficiency and increase imperial revenues rather than as attacks on aristocratic privilege. The changes appeared to be motivated by practical administrative concerns rather than political retaliation, making it difficult for opponents to rally broader support by claiming persecution or unfair treatment. The cumulative effect of these various countermeasures was to gradually weaken the organizational capabilities and economic resources that aristocratic families needed to sustain effective opposition to Wu Zetian's rule. The families found themselves increasingly isolated from each other, with reduced financial resources and limited access to the government positions and commercial opportunities that had traditionally provided the foundation for their political influence. However, Wu Zetian understood that defensive measures alone would not be sufficient to secure her long-term position as emperor. She needed to build new sources of support that could replace the traditional aristocratic power structures she was systematically undermining. This required her to identify and cultivate alternative constituencies that had interests in maintaining and expanding her reforms. The most important of these alternative constituencies consisted of the growing class of officials who had advanced through the expanded examination systems that Wu Zetian had implemented during her first years as emperor. These individuals owed their positions to merit-based selection rather than family connections, making them natural allies of reforms that emphasized competence over hereditary privilege. Wu Zetian began systematically promoting examination-based officials to more important positions within the imperial bureaucracy, creating a new administrative elite that was personally invested in her continued success. These officials understood that their career prospects depended on maintaining the merit-based systems that had enabled their advancement, giving them powerful incentives to support Wu Zetian against challenges from traditional aristocratic families. The military dimension of Wu Zetian's coalition-building efforts focused on professional officers who valued competence and effectiveness over social status and family background. Many of these officers had benefited from the military reforms she had implemented, including improved training programs, better equipment and supplies, and promotion procedures that rewarded battlefield performance rather than aristocratic connections. Wu Zetian cultivated relationships with these professional officers by continuing to provide them with the resources and support they needed to maintain military effectiveness while also offering them increased responsibilities and recognition for their contributions to imperial security. The officers who worked closely with her during this period developed genuine respect for her strategic intelligence and administrative capabilities, creating bonds of professional loyalty that transcended concerns about gender and traditional protocol. Wu Zetian was demonstrating that her administration valued productive economic activity and practical skills, rather than just theoretical knowledge and social status. This message resonated powerfully with communities that had been marginalized by traditional political systems despite their essential contributions to imperial prosperity and stability. Regional administrators represented another crucial constituency that Wu Zetian cultivated systematically during this period. Provincial governors and local officials who had implemented her reforms successfully had seen tangible improvements in their administrative effectiveness and their relationships with the populations they governed. These officials became natural advocates for expanding and continuing the reform programs that had enhanced their capabilities and improved their results. Wu Zetian maintained regular communication with successful regional administrators, seeking their advice about policy modifications and implementation strategies, while also providing them with recognition and rewards for their achievements. This relationship building created networks of experienced officials throughout the empire who had personal stakes in defending her reforms against attempts to restore traditional procedures that had been less effective. The religious dimension of Wu Zetian's coalition-building efforts involved continued cultivation of Buddhist and Taoist leaders who supported alternative interpretations of spiritual teachings about governance and political authority. The scholars and priests who had provided theological justification for her elevation to emperor continued to develop and refine their arguments, creating increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding female leadership as compatible with divine order and cosmic harmony. Wu Zetian's support for these religious scholars included funding for temple construction, sponsorship of scholarly conferences, and patronage of artistic and literary projects that explored themes related to wisdom, compassion, and effective leadership regardless of gender. These activities strengthened her relationships with religious communities while also producing cultural works that influenced broader public opinion about the legitimacy and benefits of her rule. By 661, Wu Zetian had successfully constructed a diverse coalition of supporters that included merit-based officials, professional military officers, economic constituencies, regional administrators, and progressive religious leaders. This coalition was more representative of Chinese society as a whole than the traditional aristocratic networks that had dominated imperial politics for centuries, giving her reforms a broader foundation of popular support. The strength of this coalition was tested during the autumn of 661, when aristocratic opposition to Wu Zetian's rule finally crystallized into an organized conspiracy that threatened to overthrow her government through coordinated military action. The plot involved several prominent families, retired generals, and court officials who had concluded that gradual resistance was insufficient to restore traditional governmental procedures. The conspiracy was remarkably sophisticated, involving simultaneous uprisings in multiple provinces, coordinated attacks on government installations in the capital, and plans to assassinate Wu Zetian and key supporters of her administration. The conspirators had spent months recruiting military commanders, accumulating weapons and supplies, and developing communication networks that would enable coordinated action across vast distances. Wu Zetian's intelligence services detected the conspiracy during its final planning stages, providing her with detailed information about the participants, their objectives, and their operational plans. The intelligence reports revealed both the seriousness of the threat and the extensive preparation that had been undertaken by her opponents, confirming her assessment that aristocratic resistance had evolved into an existential challenge to her continued rule. Her response to the conspiracy demonstrated both the political skills she had developed during her rise to power and the administrative capabilities she had built during her years as emperor. Rather than reacting defensively or allowing the conspirators to seize the initiative, Wu Zetian launched a comprehensive counteroffensive that turned their own preparations against them while demonstrating the strength and effectiveness of her reformed governmental systems. The military response to the conspiracy was swift, coordinated, and decisive, reflecting the improvements in communication, logistics, and strategic planning that Wu Zetian had implemented during her military reforms. Professional officers who had benefited from her policies remained loyal to her government, providing reliable forces that could suppress uprisings while protecting key installations and personnel. The bureaucratic response involved the rapid deployment of administrative resources to maintain governmental functions while managing the disruption caused by removing conspirators from their positions. Merit-based officials stepped into increased responsibilities with competence and dedication, demonstrating that the reformed civil service could maintain stability even during a major political crisis. Most importantly, the popular response to the conspiracy revealed the depth of support that Wu Zetian had built among broader segments of Chinese society. Merchants, farmers, artisans, and regional officials who had benefited from her reforms actively assisted government efforts to suppress the uprising, providing intelligence, resources, and manpower that proved essential for defeating the conspiracy. The successful suppression of the aristocratic conspiracy marked a turning point in Wu Zetian's reign, establishing her authority on foundations that were far more secure than the personal relationships and factional alliances that had initially enabled her rise to power. She had proven that her reforms could not only improve governmental effectiveness, but also create sufficient popular support to survive organized challenges from traditional power structures. The aftermath of the conspiracy provided Wu Zetian with opportunities to accelerate and expand her reform programs while eliminating remaining sources of organized opposition to her rule. These economic measures were presented as efforts to improve governmental efficiency and increase imperial revenues rather than as attacks on aristocratic privilege. The changes appeared to be motivated by practical administrative concerns rather than political retaliation, making it difficult for opponents to rally broader support by claiming persecution or unfair treatment. The cumulative effect of these various countermeasures was to gradually weaken the organizational capabilities and economic resources that aristocratic families needed to sustain effective opposition to Wu Zetian's rule. The families found themselves increasingly isolated from each other, with reduced financial resources and limited access to the government positions and commercial opportunities that had traditionally provided the foundation for their political influence. However, Wu Zetian understood that defensive measures alone would not be sufficient to secure her long-term position as emperor. She needed to build new sources of support that could replace the traditional aristocratic power structures she was systematically undermining. This required her to identify and cultivate alternative constituencies that had interests in maintaining and expanding her reforms. The most important of these alternative constituencies consisted of the growing class of officials who had advanced through the expanded examination systems that Wu Zetian had implemented during her first years as emperor. These individuals owed their positions to merit-based selection rather than family connections, making them natural allies of reforms that emphasized competence over hereditary privilege. Wu Zetian began systematically promoting examination-based officials to more important positions within the imperial bureaucracy, creating a new administrative elite that was personally invested in her continued success. These officials understood that their career prospects depended on maintaining the merit-based systems that had enabled their advancement, giving them powerful incentives to support Wu Zetian against challenges from traditional aristocratic families. These economic measures were presented as efforts to improve governmental efficiency and increase imperial revenues rather than as attacks on aristocratic privilege. The changes appeared to be motivated by practical administrative concerns rather than political retaliation, making it difficult for opponents to rally broader support by claiming persecution or unfair treatment. The cumulative effect of these various countermeasures was to gradually weaken the organizational capabilities and economic resources that aristocratic families needed to sustain effective opposition to Wu Zetian's rule. The families found themselves increasingly isolated from each other, with reduced financial resources and limited access to the government positions and commercial opportunities that had traditionally provided the foundation for their political influence. However, Wu Zetian understood that defensive measures alone would not be sufficient to secure her long-term position as emperor. She needed to build new sources of support that could replace the traditional aristocratic power structures she was systematically undermining. This required her to identify and cultivate alternative constituencies that had interests in maintaining and expanding her reforms. The most important of these alternative constituencies consisted of the growing class of officials who had advanced through the expanded examination systems that Wu Zetian had implemented during her first years as emperor. These individuals owed their positions to merit-based selection rather than family connections, making them natural allies of reforms that emphasized competence over hereditary privilege. Wu Zetian began systematically promoting examination-based officials to more important positions within the imperial bureaucracy, creating a new administrative elite that was personally invested in her continued success. These officials understood that their career prospects depended on maintaining the merit-based systems that had enabled their advancement, giving them powerful incentives to support Wu Zetian against challenges from traditional aristocratic families. The military dimension of Wu Zetian's coalition-building efforts focused on professional officers who valued competence and effectiveness over social status and family background. Many of these officers had benefited from the military reforms she had implemented, including improved training programs, better equipment and supplies, and promotion procedures that rewarded battlefield performance rather than aristocratic connections. Wu Zetian cultivated relationships with these professional officers by continuing to provide them with the resources and support they needed to maintain military effectiveness, while also offering them increased responsibilities and recognition for their contributions to imperial security. The officers who worked closely with her during this period developed genuine respect for her strategic intelligence and administrative capabilities, creating bonds of professional loyalty that transcended concerns about gender and traditional protocol. The economic constituencies that Wu Zetian courted included merchants, artisans, and farmers who had benefited from her reforms to commercial regulation, taxation policies, and infrastructure development. These groups represented a much larger portion of the Chinese population than aristocratic families, but they had traditionally been excluded from political participation and had limited influence over governmental policies. Wu Zetian's approach to building support among these economic constituencies involved both practical benefits and symbolic recognition that demonstrated her commitment to serving broader imperial interests rather than just elite preferences. The infrastructure projects she sponsored created employment opportunities and reduced transportation costs for merchants and artisans. The tax reforms she implemented reduced burdens on small farmers while ensuring that wealthy landowners paid appropriate shares of imperial revenues. More subtly, Wu Zetian began incorporating representatives of merchant and artisan communities into advisory roles within the imperial government, giving them formal channels for expressing their concerns and recommendations about policies that affected their economic activities. This inclusion was unprecedented in Chinese imperial history, where government service had traditionally been limited to scholars and aristocrats who could demonstrate mastery of classical literature and philosophical principles. The symbolic importance of including merchants and artisans in governmental processes was as significant as the practical benefits it provided. Wu Zetian was demonstrating that her administration valued productive economic activity and practical skills rather than just theoretical knowledge and social status. This message resonated powerfully with communities that had been marginalized by traditional political systems despite their essential contributions to imperial prosperity and stability. Regional administrators represented another crucial constituency that Wu Zetian cultivated systematically during this period. Provincial governors and local officials who had implemented her reforms successfully had seen tangible improvements in their administrative effectiveness and their relationships with the populations they governed. These officials became natural advocates for expanding and continuing the reform programs that had enhanced their capabilities and improved their results. Wu Zetian maintained regular communication with successful regional administrators, seeking their advice about policy modifications and implementation strategies, while also providing them with recognition and rewards for their achievements. This relationship building created networks of experienced officials throughout the empire who had personal stakes in defending her reforms against attempts to restore traditional procedures that had been less effective. The religious dimension of Wu Zetian's coalition-building efforts involved continued cultivation of Buddhist and Taoist leaders who supported alternative interpretations of spiritual teachings about governance and political authority. The scholars and priests who had provided theological justification for her elevation to emperor continued to develop and refine their arguments, creating increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding female leadership as compatible with divine order and cosmic harmony. Wu Zetian's support for these religious scholars included funding for temple construction, sponsorship of scholarly conferences, and patronage of artistic and literary projects that explored themes related to wisdom, compassion, and effective leadership regardless of gender. These activities strengthened her relationships with religious communities, while also producing cultural works that influenced broader public opinion about the legitimacy and benefits of her rule. By 661, Wu Zetian had successfully constructed a diverse coalition of supporters that included merit-based officials, professional military officers, economic constituencies, regional administrators, and progressive religious leaders. This coalition was more representative of Chinese society as a whole than the traditional aristocratic networks that had dominated imperial politics for centuries, giving her reforms a broader foundation of popular support. The strength of this coalition was tested during the autumn of 661, when aristocratic opposition to Wu Zetian's rule finally crystallized into an organized conspiracy that threatened to overthrow her government through coordinated military action. The plot involved several prominent families, retired generals, and court officials who had concluded that gradual resistance was insufficient to restore traditional governmental procedures. The conspiracy was remarkably sophisticated, involving simultaneous uprisings in multiple provinces, coordinated attacks on government installations in the capital, and plans to assassinate Wu Zetian and key supporters of her administration. The conspirators had spent months recruiting military commanders, accumulating weapons and supplies, and developing communication networks that would enable coordinated action across vast distances. Wu Zetian's intelligence services detected the conspiracy during its final planning stages, providing her with detailed information about the participants, their objectives, and their operational plans. The intelligence reports revealed both the seriousness of the threat and the extensive preparation that had been undertaken by her opponents, confirming her assessment that aristocratic resistance had evolved into an existential challenge to her continued rule. Her response to the conspiracy demonstrated both the political skills she had developed during her rise to power and the administrative capabilities she had built during her years as emperor. Rather than reacting defensively or allowing the conspirators to seize the initiative, Wu Zetian launched a comprehensive counteroffensive that turned their own preparations against them while demonstrating the strength and effectiveness of her reformed governmental systems. The military response to the conspiracy was swift, coordinated, and decisive, reflecting the improvements in communication, logistics, and strategic planning that Wu Zetian had implemented during her military reforms. Professional officers who had benefited from her policies remained loyal to her government, providing reliable forces that could suppress uprisings while protecting key installations and personnel. The bureaucratic response involved the rapid deployment of administrative resources to maintain governmental functions while managing the disruption caused by removing conspirators from their positions. Merit-based officials stepped into increased responsibilities with competence and dedication, demonstrating that the reformed civil service could maintain stability even during a major political crisis. Most importantly, the popular response to the conspiracy revealed the depth of support that Wu Zetian had built among broader segments of Chinese society. Merchants, farmers, artisans, and regional officials who had benefited from her reforms actively assisted government efforts to suppress the uprising, providing intelligence, resources, and manpower that proved essential for defeating the conspiracy. The successful suppression of the aristocratic conspiracy marked a turning point in Wu Zetian's reign, establishing her authority on foundations that were far more secure than the personal relationships and factional alliances that had initially enabled her rise to power. She had proven that her reforms could not only improve governmental effectiveness, but also create sufficient popular support to survive organized challenges from traditional power structures. The aftermath of the conspiracy provided Wu Zetian with opportunities to accelerate and expand her reform programs while eliminating remaining sources of organized opposition to her rule. The conspirators' properties were confiscated and redistributed to support governmental programs. Their positions were filled by loyal officials who supported continued innovation, and their networks were replaced by new alliances based on a shared commitment to effective governance rather than hereditary privilege. More significantly, the failed conspiracy demonstrated to potential opponents that resistance to Wu Zetian's reforms was not only futile but actively dangerous to their personal interests and family welfare. The comprehensive nature of her intelligence capabilities, the loyalty of her reformed military forces, and the breadth of popular support for her policies made organized opposition extremely risky, while offering limited prospects for success. The years following the conspiracy saw Wu Zetian's transformation from a defensive ruler trying to preserve her position into a confident emperor implementing increasingly ambitious programs designed to reshape Chinese society according to her vision of effective governance and social justice. The reforms she implemented during this period would establish precedents and create institutions that would influence Chinese development for centuries after her death. But the woman who had begun her journey as a powerless concubine and survived every challenge through intelligence, determination, and political skill understood that her ultimate legacy would depend not just on her success in maintaining power, but on her ability to create lasting changes that would benefit the Chinese people long after her remarkable reign had ended. The teenage girl who had entered the imperial court with nothing but ambition and intelligence had become the most powerful person in the world's largest empire, proving that exceptional individuals could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through careful planning, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to their objectives. Her story stands as one of history's most extraordinary examples of personal transformation and political achievement, demonstrating that even in the most traditional and hierarchical societies, remarkable individuals could create revolutionary change through the skillful application of intelligence, determination, and strategic vision. Wu Zetian's reign would continue for many more years, during which he would implement reforms that modernized the Chinese government, strengthened imperial administration, and expanded opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their social background. Her achievements as emperor would ultimately overshadow the controversies surrounding her rise to power, establishing her as one of China's most effective and transformative rulers. The concubine who became emperor had accomplished something that no woman before or since has achieved in Chinese history, creating a legacy that continues to inspire and inform discussions about leadership, gender, and political possibility more than 13 centuries after her death. Her remarkable journey from a powerless teenager to supreme authority remains one of history's most compelling stories of individual triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles, proving that intelligence, determination, and strategic vision can enable extraordinary individuals to achieve the impossible and transform the world around them.